Chapter 221, Being a Survivor of Disaster. Translator, Novel Saga Editor, Novel Saga. Where am I? Shi Mu thought something as he looked around. He then murmured to himself. Suddenly, there was a surge in the surrounding mist. Then, virtual shadows of two other pythons broke into this chaotic world. The body of one of the pythons was wrapped in a mass of white light. There was a pair of wings on its back. Its overwhelming strength couldn't be considered inferior to that of the three-headed python. The other one was an even bigger python. Its body was covered with green scales. It was twice as big as the three-headed python. There was an extremely formidable aura around its body. It seemed to be far above a Xian level beast soul. Surprisingly, it was an earth-ranked ominous beast soul. It's not good. These two are Zhagu's beast souls. Shi Mu was flabbergasted. He then recalled the moments before he had lost his consciousness. But, he could only vaguely remember that scene. However, the shadows of the two pythons didn't give him time to ponder over this matter. And, they pounced towards him in a threatening manner. They then opened their mouths, and bit at Shi Mu, who was in the form of a mass of white light. Roar! The three-headed python standing beside Shi Mu issued a loud roar. The size of its body was relatively smaller than the red and green pythons. But, it was courageous enough to swoop down towards them. It rushed forward, and blocked the two ominous pythons. The shadows of the three pythons coiled around each other, and started to bite each other. The build of the three-headed python looked relatively smaller. But, it didn't show any sign of weakness in the battle since it was blessed with three heads. However, it didn't take long before it fell into a disadvantageous situation because it had to deal with two enemies at the same time. The radiance of its body dimmed at a very fast speed, so much so that it could be seen with naked eyes. Shi Mu became anxious as he witnessed this scene. But, he couldn't come forward to extend his help owing to his state. Roar! The green-scaled python swayed, and whipped its tail severely on the three-headed python's body. The three-headed python was sent flying along with the red python. The green-scaled python turned its head. An ominous gleam streaked across its eyes. Then, it swooped towards the mass of white light that was the incarnated form of Shi Mu. It seemed that the three-headed python wanted to rush back to Shi Mu's side. But, its body was tightly bound by the red python. So, it was unable to break itself free. The green-scaled python opened its mouth, and bit towards the mass of white light. In fact, it exerted its full might to tear him apart. Suddenly, Shi Mu's heart was struck by a sense of apprehension. He had a bad premonition of an imminent danger. He was frightened that he would surely lose his sanity if the mass of white light was gobbled up by the python. Shi Mu's spirit shuddered with a fit of terror. An extremely vicious aura spread from the depth of his spirit. Then, a streak of white light darted out from the depths of the mass of white light, and got condensed into a fuzzy shadow of a white ape. The green-scaled python's eyes were smeared with an extremely frightened look as its eyes fell on the white ape. It immediately turned around, and dashed away. The white ape's shadow raised its head, and issued a loud roar. Then, it pounded its fist towards the green-scaled python in a ferocious manner. The green-scaled python felt a little fluctuation behind its body. Then, a mass of misty white whirlpool emerged behind it. The python whirled around, and issued a frightened scream. But, its body shattered into pieces, and transformed into a group of green fireflies. Those fireflies began to spin along with the white whirlpool. The red python wasn't far from the white ape. It seemed to have sensed the pressure of the white ape's domineering aura. So, its body turned stiff. But, the three-headed python seemed to be unaffected. An ominous glint flashed through its eyes. Then, its three heads began to nip at the body of the red python. It exerted its full might to rip the red python apart. The red python's body was soon torn into three pieces. The white ape's shadow waved its arms. It seemed as if it wanted to do something. But then, its stature turned fuzzy, and began to sway from side to side. It gradually dissipated along with the white whirlpool that was near its body. Only the green fireflies remained floating in the air. Shi Mu was struck dumb as he witnessed this scene. He felt that he had grasped a little clue. But, he couldn't figure out what it was. Roar! Roar! The three-headed python issued a few cheerful roars in excitement. Then, it swallowed down all the severed pieces of the red python. After that, its middle head issued a suction force in order to absorb that floating group of green fireflies. These fireflies had emerged from the shattered pieces of the green-scaled python. Its three heads had soon gobbled up that group of fireflies. A layer of black light gleamed on the surface of the three-headed python's body as it absorbed two beast souls in succession. Then, a black light flashed beside one of its heads. After that, the fourth head of the python emerged. But, it wasn't the end. Then, the fifth head also began to emerge. A meatball could be seen bulging on its neck. It seemed as if the fifth head would sprout out at any moment. Shi Mu's heart brimmed with happiness as he saw this. But then, a cloud of darkness spread before his eyes, and he lost his consciousness once again. Shi Mu regained his consciousness after an unknown period of time. A burst of boisterous voices fell into his ears as he sobered up. The clamorous sounds made his brows crease into a frown. "You're indeed a formidable incarnation. I'm also Master Shi Tiou's spirit pet. But, I'm like a light of a firefly before the magnificent radiance of the bright moon if compared with you. I'm just a small and ugly parrot in front of your dazzling brilliance. But, my inconsequential existence is a tiny bit useful to my master. So, can you take the soul flame in your hand a little bit away from me? Otherwise, my fragile body will be roasted." Ah! Parrot Cai was the obvious source of this clamorous voice. Its voice was permeated with a touch of flattery. But, it was also issuing mournful screams from time to time. Shi Mu opened his eyes. But, a fit of exhaustion raided him, and made his body extremely heavy. He mustered his energy, and turned his head. He then looked around, and found himself lying on the ground. Zha Gu's headless body lay on the ground near him. Yan Luo stood to one side. It seemed to have restored its body by now. Even the aura around its body seemed much more formidable than before. Yan Luo's shattered left arm also seemed to have made a full recovery since it held Cai's feet with it. A small cluster of white flames could be seen in its right hand. It was swinging the parrot's body, as if it playing with him. But, Cai looked scared, and was shouting in fear. It could neither flutter its wings, nor could he try to fly away since its feet had been caught by Yan Luo. Yan Luo noticed that Shi Mu had woken up. It put away the soul flame from its right hand, and threw Cai away. Then, its stature flashed, and appeared in front of Shi Mu. Shi Mu was dumbfounded. Yan Luo had its back towards him. So, it was obvious that it couldn't have seen him awake. The soul flames in Yan Luo's eye sockets looked dark blue in color. Moreover, there was a touch of purple amid the blue color. Yan Luo, Shi Mu was familiar with the changing color of Yan Luo's soul flames. So, he had realized that Yan Luo had stepped into a new realm. Yan Luo was now at the consummate stage of the Xian Tian realm. Moreover, it seemed that it might proceed further, and step into the realm of an earth-ranked warrior soon enough. This was a good thing for Shi Mu. But, the speed of Yan Luo's attainment was too frightening to believe. He couldn't help but feel a little anxious about it. Yan Luo's soul flames flickered as it looked at Shi Mu from top to bottom. It seemed as if it was feeling a little relieved. Then, it nodded towards Shi Mu. It didn't wait for Shi Mu to speak anything, and a burst of black smoke emerged on the surface of its body. Then, its stature turned fuzzy, and it vanished into thin air. It seemed to have returned to the dead spirit world. Shi Mu was taken aback. "Shi Tiu, you woke up. I was extremely worried about you." Cai swooped over, and landed on Shi Mu's shoulder as he saw that Yan Luo had disappeared. Well, there's nothing to be worried about. But, I want to take rest. You go, and keep a watch on me, Shi Mu said. Cai wanted to say something. But, it saw that Shi Mu's entire body was drenched in blood, and his face looked exhausted. So, it had no other option but to comply. It fluttered its wings, and flew high up in the sky. Shi Mu sat down cross-legged. Then, he started to practice his cultivation art. He had suffered severe damages on many places in his body. Moreover, the consumption of his real qi seemed quite severe. He also felt an acute pain in his head due to excessive loss of his spirit power. Fortunately, none of his injuries was fatal. Shi Mu took a deep breath, and continued to sit with his legs crossed for a while. Then, he stood up, and walked over to Zhagu's corpse. He then picked up the green whip that lay nearby. His heart brimmed with happiness as he examined it. The magic formula engraved on the surface of the green whip seemed a lot more complicated than his own meteoric iron black blade's formula. Surprisingly, it was a high-grade magic tool. Zhagu's knife also seemed to be a rare magic weapon. Shi Mu didn't need this knife for his own use. But, he still took it so that he could exchange it for a considerable amount of money. There was also a beast soul bag lying on the ground. But, it was completely empty. Shi Mu was dumbfounded. He associated this incident to the sudden advancement of Yan Luo's cultivation, and understood the whole story. He collected the 3 magic tools. Then, he continued to fumble with Zhagu's body. Suddenly, his eyes got pulled towards Zhagu's left hand. There was a grayish-black ring on Zhagu's finger. It was emitting faint rays of light. Shi Mu's eyes lit up. He took the ring off his hand. He then poured a drop of his blood on it. After that, he poured his spirit into the ring in order to explore it. This ring was a storage magic tool like he had expected. However, the space inside it was a lot smaller than his own storage ring. But, it was still a rare treasure. Shi Mu's face beamed with an ecstatic look. Almost 50% of this storage ring was already filled with various kinds of things. He waved his hand, and several things appeared on the ground with a crashing sound. Most of the things were various kinds of top-grade ores. Shi Mu had a very deep understanding of ores. He knew that there were all kinds of rare and precious ores inside this ring that could be used to cast magic weapons. Moreover, the value of these ores was considerably high. There were also some other things apart from the ores. There was a stack of gold leaves, a few bottles of pills, some ancient books, and a jade slip. Dozens of spirit stones were also present therein. Shi Mu picked up a few books along with the jade slip, and put them aside. He wanted to inspect something else first. The monetary worth of those gold leaves was perhaps not less than 3 million. Moreover, a few bottles were loaded with some precious restoration pills. There was also a bottle that was loaded with detoxifying pills. Shi Mu knew only a little about the pills that belonged to the barbarian race. In fact, he could differentiate them in a very vague manner. There were 2 middle-ranked spirit stones amid a dozen or more spirit stones. One of them was a water attribute, and the other one was a fire attribute spirit stone. Shi Mu stacked up these things into his own storage ring. Then, he picked up a few ancient books, and glanced through them. The content of these ancient books didn't seem to be special. These books were basically about geography, the unofficial history of the continent, and so on. Shi Mu finally picked up the jade slip, and poured his spirit into it. His face soon sparkled with joy. The jade slip was the map of the barbarian wasteland. It was an extremely detailed map that illustrated the minute details about the Black Rock Mountains. Shi Mu recovered his spirit after a moment. It would be much easier for him to pass through the barbarian wasteland with the help of this map. He exhaled a deep breath, and calmed his mind down. Then, he waved his hand, and received the remaining things. After that, he burnt down Zhagu's body to ashes. He then looked for a secure place, and sat down cross-legged. He took out a jade bottle and a healing pill from his clothes. He then stuck 2 rejuvenation charms on his chest's wound. After that, he sat down cross-legged once again. In the dead spirit world, Yan Luo stood still in the center of a small basin. It held a bone spear in its hand. The soul flames were flickering within its eye sockets. Several piles of bones could be seen all over the place. In fact, there were 200 or more heaps in the surroundings. Most of these bones still looked complete. Moreover, each pile could form a complete human skeleton. These skeletons didn't seem to have been defeated in a battle. A row of blood moons were suspended in the dark sky. The number of the blood moons was still 11. But, one of the moons looked a little bleak in comparison with the others. An hour later, Shi Mu stood on a slope of the hill. He was gazing far into the western horizon. The golden setting sun hung low on the horizon like a disk. It was sprinkling its soft and warm golden luster across the world. There were black-colored rolling hills behind him. They seemed to be bathing in the afterglow of the setting sun. It looked as if they were clad in a layer of bright golden radiance. "Master, you're awesome. You exterminated the Earth-ranked powerhouse. You're 10 times more formidable than the obese Manju." "Oh, no. In fact, you're 100 times more formidable," Cai said while fluttering its wings on Shi Mu's shoulder. "It wasn't me who killed that man. I've told you this several times. I know that the human skeleton has killed him. But, it's the same thing. I think I'm following the right person. It has a name. It's called Yan Luo." Shi Mu retracted his vision from the distance. He then started to walk down the slope. "I saw that the skeleton was holding you when I first arrived. It really scared the hell out of me. Be careful. It might chide you in the future. Yan Luo belongs to the dark territory, right?" "What's this dark territory?" "Oh, by the way, Zhagu once spoke the words Dark Moon Disciple. What is this thing? What reward will I get if I tell you about it?" The parrot moved, and took a more comfortable position on Shi Mu's shoulder. "There's no reward. But, I know that you can't control yourself from spitting it out." Shi Mu stamped his foot on the ground, and jumped in the air. "I'll certainly refrain myself," the parrot replied. Shi Mu didn't say anything further. He continued with his journey in a silent manner. A little time passed. The parrot opened his mouth. It seemed as if it wanted to say something, but it remained silent. It continued to do this for some time. And, it swallowed its words every time it opened its mouth. "Cai, was young Master Zhu a deep moon believer?" Shi Mu asked while passing through the pieces of rocks. I'm not telling you." "Fine. Forget about it." The color of the sky was darkening. The setting sun gradually turned into a pale yellow ball of light. The half-red and half-yellow afterglow of the setting sun could be seen across the horizon. A bird and a man could be seen advancing towards a westward direction while quarreling along the way. Chapter 222, Seeing Injustice. Translator, Novel Saga Editor, Novel Saga. 1 month later. It was noon, the scorching sun was high up in the sky. A desolate mountain range was covered in silence. Several traces of streams and springs that once flowed could be seen everywhere on the mountain. It was hard to tell the reason, but they had dried up. Moreover, the skeletons of a few animals could be seen around the dried-up water sources. The most conspicuous sight was a remnant cave along the side of the road. It seemed from the traces on its surface that this cave had been artificially created by people a few years ago. A tall silhouette was approaching towards the place from a distance. He was walking out slowly from the depths of the mountain range. That person was clad in black clothes. The color of his skin was bronze. His facial features were outlined distinctly. His eyes were sparkling brightly. He had a head full of jet black hair with a ponytail that seemed to have been tied up in a casual manner. The end of his ponytail seemed as if a black current would fling and splash with his movements. He carried a black blade and a short stick on his back, and they were hung in intersecting position. In addition, a stone tied up to an iron chain was wrapped around his waist. All these characteristics gave off an ambience of wild and unrestrained aura around that person. This person was none other than Shi Mu. He had once attempted to let the parrot find the traces of Jin Xiaochai and others after he had gotten rid of Zha Gu. But, he hadn't been able to find their trails or footprints. It seemed as if they had disappeared from the world. Therefore, he had to continue his journey alone. Fortunately, he had gotten his hands on a detailed map after he had killed Zha Gu. Therefore, he hadn't bumped into any exceptionally perilous situation during this month, except for a few ominous beasts. He would continue on his journey during the daytime, and would summon Yan Luo on moonless nights. Yan Luo would accompany him in practicing and refining his cultivation and martial arts. And, he had gradually gained expertise in all kinds of offensive skills as a result. Suddenly, he stopped on a hilltop. The parrot Cai flew from his shoulder without even receiving his instructions. And, it flew straight into the sky. According to the map, Shi Mu had already stepped out of the scope of Barbarian's wasteland. He had entered into the territory of the central mainland a couple of days ago. However, he had traveled here only to notice that the entire route was almost the same, a piece of barren and desolate land. This area wasn't much different from the Barbarian's wasteland. He had expected that the central mainland would be blessed with abundant sources of spiritual aura. But, the present scenario seemed to be inexplicably different from what he had imagined. And, this had left him to believe that there was some problem with Zha Gu's map. Shi Mu readjusted his direction, and began to walk down the mountain. 3 days later, Shi Mu appeared outside a small frontier town. This small town was situated next to a mountain range. It extended to a considerably wide area. It was labeled on the map as the overlooking the mountain town. The rear part of the overlooking the mountain town stood by the side of a tall and huge mountain range that extended to a vast area. Therefore, this town had got its name due to its proximity to the mountains. There were several artificially dug water channels and drainages around the town. This made it evident that this place must have been a fertile land with plentiful sources of water. But now, these channels had dried up. The traces of desertification had also begun to appear on the land. It now looked like a barren land. Shi Tou, we can finally have a feast to our heart's content. Cai's eyes sparkled as it gazed towards the town in the front. It then flapped its wings, and shouted in an excited manner. Shi Mu didn't say anything. He started to walk in the direction of the town. He soon realized that most of the buildings constructed in this town were exceptionally magnificent and beautiful. However, the streets were sparsely populated, and gave the feeling of a desolate bleakness. There was no pedestrian on the streets and the restaurants alongside the street. They all were empty. They seemed to be narrating the story about the bleakness of this place. Suddenly, a burst of weeping and wailing sounds were heard from the front. Shi Mu's mind moved into action, and he started to walk forward. He then turned around a corner, and saw the source of the sound. There was a group of 4 people. They all were dressed in beastly robes. They were shouting and yelling at people. They were using spears to thrash a dozen or more young and robust men. The hands of these young men had been tied up. And, those beastly robed men were pushing these young men to move forward. The young men's faces were smeared with a hint of resentment. But, none of them dared to speak anything. They merely continued to move forward. Dozens of women, children, and elderly people could also be seen around these young men. They were kneeling on the ground, and were weeping as they asked for mercy. The 4 beastly robed men were Hotian warriors. 3 of them were Hotian middle stage warriors, and the 4th one was at the advanced stage of the Hotian realm. He was a triangle-eyed middle-aged man, and seemed to be leading this small group. Shi Mu could indistinctly draw the inference of the current situation from the wailing and pleading voices. These warriors seemed to have barged into the town in order to capture a few people for mining. "Emissary Xiang, please stay. A grizzled-haired elderly man hurried past Shi Mu by taking the support of a petite man's arm. The complexion of the triangle-eyed man sank. He turned around, and looked at the grizzled-haired old man. Then, his face got smeared with impatience. "Emissary Xiang, please be generous, and don't punish them too severely. I request you to let them off the hook. This town doesn't have many young men. I'm afraid that the people left behind will starve to death if these people were to leave the town as well," the grizzled-haired town chief pleaded as he pointed his finger at the young men who had been tied up. "Old fool, we've already paid enough rewards for them. In fact, we've paid more than twice of what we used to. Even 1/10 of the total rewards would be considered enough for all of you. But, you're still urging for more remuneration? I have to take these people at all costs," the triangle-eyed man replied. "I don't want your money. I only want my husband back. Don't take my son away," the grizzled-haired chief pleaded once again. The surrounding weak and elderly women continued to weep for mercy. However, the triangle-eyed man remained unmoved. A few women were begging while holding his thighs. But, he shoved them away. He then urged the other people to be a bit faster, and make the young men walk. "Elder Xiang, there's someone blocking our way," one of the beastly-robed men said. The triangle-eyed man was startled. He raised his head, and looked in that direction. A tall and sturdy man appeared in his line of sight. He was clad in black clothes. A parrot sat on his shoulder. It couldn't be said when he had walked past a few people, and had stationed himself in front of them. He was staring at the triangle-eyed man with an expressionless face. It was none other than Shi Mu. The grizzled-haired man gazed at Shi Mu in amazement. The weak and old people kneeling on the road looked startled. Even the captured young men who were brimming with anger felt surprised. "Your Excellency's face seems unfamiliar to me. Are you an outsider?" The triangle-eyed man sized up Shi Mu. He then asked. "Set them free." Shi Mu didn't say anything. Instead, the parrot on his shoulder spoke up. "I would like to give a piece of advice to your Excellency. Don't try to stick your butt in the matters of our bestial mountain sect. Be careful. Don't invite unnecessary trouble." The triangle-eyed man was struck dumb for a moment. But then, the corners of his eyes twitched, and he spoke up in a raised voice. "Get lost." Shi Mu didn't budge an inch. Instead, he said, "You're asking for death." The triangle-eyed man blazed with fury. He shook the spear in his hand, and a burst of green luminescence spurted out on its surface. Then, the tip of the spear trembled. "Chi! Chi!" A shrill and ear-deafening sound rang out in the air. An intense gust of wind surged up along with this. The glaring green light on the tip of the spear started to spark in a range of 3 feet. It soon took the shape of a huge green wolf head. The triangle-eyed man then moved, and pounced forward. The wolf head rushed towards Shi Mu at the same time. The remaining 3 beastly-robed men also swooped towards Shi Mu. The long spears in their hands burst into a fit of trembles. Then, they took the form of 3 small wolf heads, and rushed towards Shi Mu. There was a very short distance between both the sides. Therefore, the 4 green wolf heads arrived in front of Shi Mu in a split second while carrying an intense cold wind along with them. Shi Mu's lips moved as the spearhead arrived close to him. Then, a streak of white light flew from his hand, and condensed into a shell-like light blue shield in front of his body. After that, several white-colored magic characters began to circulate on the surface of the protective shield. Boom! Boom! Intermittent bursts of explosive sounds resounded. The 4 wolf heads got ruptured as soon as they collided with the pale blue shield. Then, dozens of glaring light beams plummeted down on the protective shield. This triggered intense air waves which began to ripple in all directions. However, the pale blue protective shield still remained placid. Shi Mu's mouth opened, and spouted a group of 4 white chi clouds before those 4 warriors could act again. The clouds of white chi flashed forward, and passed through the chests of all the 4 men. This shot was the latest usage of the Qi explosion technique that Shi Mu had explored during this journey. Now, he could spout multiple attacks of white Qi at a stretch if a certain amount of magic power was accumulated inside his body. Moreover, the might of his Qi explosion technique had grown bigger along with the enhancement of the art of accumulating spirit power. In fact, the might of this attack couldn't be considered weaker than a Houtian consummate stage warrior's attack if it was executed properly. However, Shi Mu hadn't poured his entire strength into this attack. Ping! 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 A series of muffled sounds echoed. 3 of the beastly robed men were closer to Shi Mu. Therefore, they couldn't escape the attack. And, they were struck in their chests by the white Qi. The white Qi bumped into their chests, and erupted into a mass of white Qi waves. The 3 men were struck to fly backwards as a result. The cloth around their chest area looked tattered and badly mutilated. The complexions of the 3 men turned deathly pale. The Qi and blood within their bodies began to surge. They couldn't even get up for a while. However, the triangle-eyed man had held the spear in front of his chest in a horizontal manner. Consequently, the white Qi had bumped against his spear, and had ruptured. But, an enormous force had welled up on his spear. And, this had forced him to move 3 or 4 steps backwards. This dispelled the impact of the violent Qi waves. Spirit-grade magician. His complexion changed. His voice had barely faded when a mass of white Qi darted from Shi Mu's hands, and arrived in front of him in a flash. The triangle-eyed man thought to use his spear to ward off the attack. But, the mass of white Qi flashed, and transformed into a 10 feet long white Qi chain. Then, the chain bundled him firmly on the spot. The might of the Qi ring pile was almost equivalent to the strength of a Xiantian primary stage warrior. So, the man was tied up in a matter of a few breaths. This technique was more than sufficient to deal with a Houtian warrior. Shi Tou, great work. Now, beat them to death. The parrot fluttered its wings, and shouted in applause. Shi Mu didn't even cast a glance at the 4 men after this attack. Instead, he turned around, and walked over to the old and feeble women. He then said, "Unshackle your family members. You can go home now." The stunned young men and their family members burst into tears of joy as they heard this. Many dejected and resigned to fate people stepped forward at once. They then knelt down before Shi Mu, and pressed their foreheads to the ground. Shi Mu felt helpless as he saw this. Suddenly, the chain around the triangle-eyed man vanished. He then crawled up to his feet. The other 3 beastly robed men also struggled to stand up. Then, they moved closer to the triangle-eyed man. The surrounding young men and women were alarmed as they saw the 4 men. They then drew backwards, and hid behind Shi Mu. "Don't dare to intervene in the matters of our bestial mountain sect. Also, don't dare to walk away from here if you are courageous enough." The triangle-eyed man shot an intense look at Shi Mu as he said. "Get lost." Shi Mu's brows snapped into a frown. However, the parrot on his shoulder stuck out its chest, and spoke up in an arrogant manner before Shi Mu could say anything. The triangle-eyed man noticed Shi Mu's gaze sweeping over him in a fierce manner. He then turned around, and fled away. The other 3 men also followed after him. The young men and their family members expressed their gratitude to Shi Mu as they saw that the 4 men had ran away. Then, they gradually dispersed. "This old man is the chief of this mountain town. My name is Lu Do. May I venture to ask the righteous man's honorable last name?" "We're truly fortunate that we received this help from you today." The grizzled-haired chief stepped forward, cupped his hands and said with deep veneration. He seemed to be anxious even though his words were giving off the feeling of happiness. "I'm Shi Mu. I was just passing through your noble town." Shi Mu extended his hand, and stopped the old chief from saluting him. "Righteous man Shi, I can see that you are tired and covered in dust. It seems that you haven't even eaten a proper meal. This old man's family happens to have opened a restaurant. Shall we go there if you don't mind?" The old chief invited him. Well, that's great. Shi Tou and Cai are almost starving to death. The parrot flapped its wings, and shouted energetically. Shi Mu hit the parrot's head with his finger, and nodded to the elderly chief in agreement. The chief turned around by taking the support of the petite man by his side. Then, he slowly started to walk in a certain direction. Shi Mu also started to walk alongside him at a moderate pace. Chapter 223, Betrayal. Translator, Novel Saga Editor, Novel Saga. Chief Lu, what's the matter with this bestial mountain sect? Shi Mu asked. Ah, it's a long story. Our mountain town is actually, the elderly chief shook his head and started to explain everything as they walked side by side. Shi Mu finally got to know a lot of things about the mainland after he listened to the explanation of the elderly chief. This mountain town was a small frontier town that belonged to a small nation, Song Nation. And, this nation was situated in the eastern part of the Liu Shan Kingdom. The bestial mountain sect was one of the sects of Song Nation. It inadvertently discovered a spirit stone mine in the Grand Mountains. In addition, they found that the rear part of this mountain town was lent against the mountain range. Therefore, they dispatched people to the vicinity to recruit the residents of the small towns. They would then make them excavate spirit stones for them. The bestial mountain sect announced to offer considerably high remuneration to the people who would agree to go to this mountain for mining. Consequently, the strong and sturdy young men of this town started to struggle and compete with each other to go. And, this town enjoyed an era of prosperity in those days. However, the town's residents gradually realized that only a part of the total people who were sent to the mine were able to return safely. Furthermore, it wasn't long before a greater part of the people who could return suddenly died a violent death. The bestial mountain sect later offered a considerable amount of compensation for this incident. However, they also continued to raise the remuneration from time to time since the number of young and strong men continued to decline rapidly in this town over the time. Eventually, there arrived a time when no one in the town wanted to go. It was reported that a grand ceremony was going to be held in the Liu Shan Kingdom. It would be held after almost 30 years. The sects of the surrounding nations seemingly needed to offer a large number of spirit stones as a tribute in this ceremony. Therefore, everyone across the Song Nation was mining aggressively in recent years. The people who were in charge of the mining began to send people to the town frequently with the passage of time. They would drag away the strong and capable men to the mine by paying twice remuneration to them. The Song Nation wasn't a large nation. But, the bestial mountain sect commanded a very high status in this nation even though it was only a small sect in the central mainland. Therefore, the resident of the town couldn't turn anywhere for the help. The two of them eventually arrived in front of a two-storied restaurant. The elderly chief turned around to look at Shi Mu. He then sighed and said, "Righteous man Shi, there are many powerful people in the bestial mountain sect. The people who guard the mine here are far more powerful than the messengers whom you have seen before. This old man would suggest that you should leave our mountain town as soon as possible after you finish your meal." "Thank you for your kindness, Chief," Shi Mu replied. The chief shook his head and didn't speak anything further. He then walked into the restaurant by taking the support of the petite man. Shi Mu also followed after him. The restaurant looked quite clean at a glance. But, the tables and chairs were slightly shabby. Some simple home-cooked dishes were put on the table, but Shi Mu hadn't had a good meal for almost 6 months. Therefore, Shi Mu gobbled down a lot. The parrot was no different. The elderly chief was left awestruck on seeing their unbelievable appetite. The chief didn't accept money for the meal in the end. Shi Mu didn't force him too much either. Shi Mu asked the chief to suggest him an inn to stay in after he had eaten his meal. The inn was quite atmospheric and attractive like most of the buildings in the town. Shi Mu chose the best room there. There was also a spacious yard outside the room. There were only 3 rooms in addition to the courtyard's front gate. But, the other 2 rooms seemed unoccupied at this time. So, the small courtyard appeared very quiet and lonely. But, this was an ideal situation, and left Shi Mu to feel very satisfied. In a quite magnificent courtyard somewhere in the town. Father, Mr. Bai won't let this matter slip by. This man Shi Mu wouldn't stand any chance against Mr. Bai if he returns at the designated time. All this happened because of him. How can we possibly deal with the situation if Mr. Bai decides to vent him anger on us? The petite man looked at the elderly chief and said. The chief was seated on a chair at this moment. He bore an expressionless face. Young Ji, we have to resign to fate. Our mountain town is popular because of the mountain. And, it will eventually meet its destruction because of the mountain only. The grizzled-haired man shook his head and heaved a sigh. This kid is the means that can make this town evade this calamity. The petite man rolled his eyes. What is it? Don't tell me you. The chief abruptly stood up and pointed his finger at the petite man. Father, we clearly know that Mr. Bai will never let Shi Mu off so easily. So, we might as well take the initiative to inform the whereabouts of Shi Mu to Mr. Bai. This action will make our position clear before him. Then, he shouldn't look into this matter. Moreover, I have also heard people say that magicians usually carry spirit stones. We know that Shi Mu is also a magician. So, he must have carried plenty of spirit stones on his person. Mr. Bai will be very happy when he seizes his treasure. So, eliminating the town's mining quota wouldn't remain a major problem if that happens. After all, this isn't the only town in the vicinity. So, they would barely run short of people because of the dozen or more our town provides, the petite man said. It's out of question. We can't repay kindness and debts of gratitude with foul means. We will certainly suffer the divine punishment if we do. The chief immediately declined the idea. Father, the welfare of our entire town depends upon this matter. I admit that many people of this town have zipped their mouths. But, their hearts act as a mirror that reveals their true feelings. Someone would have already rushed to the mine to notify this incident by now. The petite man lowered his voice as he said this. You, the elderly chief fell down on his chair. His complexion turned gloomy and he remained speechless for a long time. The petite man's corners of the mouth curled into a smile as he noticed that the elderly man didn't resort to any action. He felt relieved and took his leave. The moonlight was bright and glittery that night. The buildings in the town looked magnificent, and it seemed as if they had been shrouded in a curtain of faint silver luster of the moon. Shi Mu sat on his bed with his legs crossed. He was currently in the hotel's room. His eyes were closed, and he was absorbed in his practice. Suddenly, his heart throbbed as an image appeared in his mind. It was the image of a line of 16 beastly-robed warriors. They held long spears in their hands. They were flooding into the hotel's front gate at this moment. A petite man and a dark-skinned youth stood timidly on the sidelines as yes man. Shi Mu stood up, shoved open the door, and walked out the room. He then quietly stood and waited in the courtyard for a long time. A moment later, a person's silhouette flashed at the door of the courtyard. A beastly-robed man flushed in the courtyard. He was a tall middle-aged man who seemed to possess an overwhelming might. He was startled when his eyes fell on Shi Mu, who quietly stood in the center of the courtyard. Consequently, his footsteps slowed down, and he approached Shi Mu slowly. Then, a person's silhouette flashed behind that man. And, 15 beastly-robed martial warriors rushed in at once. They stood on both sides like trained warriors. They quickly formed 3 small spear arrays. Each array had 5 men, and was plum-shaped. They had soon made an encirclement around Shi Mu. A very formidable and profound aura could be felt around the beastly-robed middle-aged man. He was surprisingly a Xiantian primary stage powerhouse. Only 3 of these men were Hotian advanced stage warriors. These 3 were leading the groups. And, the remaining people were merely Hotian middle stage warriors. Moreover, the triangle-eyed man whom Shi Mu had seen before was also there. He was also one of the 3 Hotian advanced stage men who was leading a group. He had taken his position behind Shi Mu. I didn't expect that your excellency would be a Xian Tian warrior. No wonder you dare to meddle in the matter of our bestial mountain sect. I am Bai Xiaofeng of the bestial mountain sect. May I ask your excellency's surname? And which sect he belongs to, the middle-aged man said. Then, he moved a step forward in a calm and collected manner. The triangle-eyed man's body quivered as he heard these words. I'll tell you if you beat me, Shi Mu replied. Well, it's a deal. Mr. Bai laughed and said. His voice had barely faded when he stomped his right foot on the ground. Then, his stature darted towards Shi Mu like a wild beast while carrying a strong gust of wind. The spear he held in his hand suddenly exuded bright silver light. Then, a thick layer of silver luminescence bubbled up and enveloped the spear. He then thrust it forward in a fierce manner. A 10-feet-long silver leopard appeared. 2 of its feet sprang from the silver luminescence of the spearhead. It seemed as if it was flying in the air. It pounced towards Shi Mu. And, it seemed to be carrying a wisp of demon qi. A layer of blue light emerged on the spearhead of all the men who stood in the 3 spear arrays as this happened. Then, a blue wolf head appeared in front of each spear arrays, each one was 5 feet in size. After that, 3 spear arrays were activated. Chi, the 3 blue wolf heads rushed towards Shi Mu from 3 directions with a shrill ear-deafening sound. They were about to launch a converging attack on him. And, they had sealed up all escape routes. However, Shi Mu didn't budge an inch from his original place. Only a layer of white radiance emerged on his left hand, and his whole body was enveloped by a layer of a white shield as a result. His right hand moved, and a shadow flashed behind his body. The short stick appeared in his hand, and got covered by a layer of blue light. Then, Shi Mu wielded his hand, and a mountain-like blue stick shadow darted out. It severely pounded the wolf head that had been condensed by the spear array on his left. Shi Mu turned his head as this happened. Then, he opened his mouth, and spouted 5 continuous white qi towards the blue wolf head of the spear array to his right. Boom! A loud rumble was heard. Meanwhile, the silver leopard pounded on the pale blue protective shield, and a burst of dazzling silver light flashed. The pale blue shield trembled violently by this impact. Consequently, the shield's brightness slightly dimmed. But, it surprisingly didn't rupture. On the other side, a mountain-like blue stick shadow and 5 masses of white qi also smashed against the blue wolf heads on both sides. A series of dull thumping sound resounded. The 2 wolf heads got twisted and burst out. The shadows of 10 individuals were sent flying backwards by the impact like the clouds scudding across the sky. They rolled on the ground for some time. Then, they lost their consciousness. However, the last spear array's blue wolf head pounced toward Shi Mu from behind. Boom! A loud rumble echoed. Blue and white colored light burst out as the wolf head struck the blue light shield. The wolf head exploded and dispersed with a loud sound. However, the magic characters that were continuously roaming on the pale blue shield seemed to be on the verge of becoming transparent. But, it still wasn't defeated and dispersed by this attack. Shi Mu suddenly whirled around, opened his mouth, and spurted out 5 more masses of white qi at a stretch. Boom! The spear array of the triangular-eyed man was excessively close to the white qi airwaves. Hence, his men were sent flying backwards by the intense impact. They crashed severely on the ground, and didn't wake up. Suddenly, Shi Mu sensed a surging wave of magic power at the top of his head. Then, a black light flashed in the air. A black beast cage appeared before him out of nowhere, and enveloped him. Bai Xiaofeng's stature moved, and he dashed toward Shi Mu. A dazzling silver light beam emerged on his spearhead. Then, the spearhead suddenly grew 5 times bigger, and started to look like dazzling silver rays of light. It then penetrated through the black beast cage, and thrust toward Shi Mu. Shi Mu was unable to evade the attack since he was trapped inside the cage. Suddenly, he issued a loud shout. Die! The short stick in his hand exuded a glaring blue light. He then brandished it in front of him, and multiple overlapping layers of mountain-like stick shadows appeared in front of him out of thin air. They then formed 7 layers of overlapping blue light mountains to welcome the huge silver spearhead. A tyrannical force erupted as the silver spearhead touched the first mountain-like shield. They left the glaring blue light and the silver spearhead shaking in a fierce manner for a moment. After that, the second and the third layer of light mountain were struck. Bang! A loud explosive sound was heard. The gigantic silver spearhead was eventually rooted and dispersed. Moreover, an enormous force cascaded down along the spearhead, and left Bai Xiaofeng to feel stuffy in his heart. He couldn't endure, and retreated a few steps back in quick succession. Fortunately, Shi Mu couldn't chase after him since he was trapped inside the black cage. Suddenly, the remaining 4 layers of blue light mountain hit the black cage in a forceful manner. Boom! 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 A chain of explosions rang out in the air. A ball of green light exploded. Then, an overwhelming force was released. This left the best cage to tremble endlessly. Several black-colored magic characters began to appear on the surface of the cage. And, the beast cage again became completely secured with a flash of light. He, Your Excellency is trapped inside the trapping beast charm. There's no way you can come out of it unless you possess the strength of a Xiantian advanced stage warrior. Bai Xiaofeng found a firm footing on the ground at first. He then said with a smile. Chapter 224, Anecdotes about the Ascension to Immortality Ceremony. Translator, Novel Saga Editor, Novel Saga. Bai Xiaofeng's voice had barely faded when Shi Mu extended his hand, and pulled out the black blade from his back at a moderate pace. After that, his hands moved and connected the black blade with the short stick. An 8-feet-long hilted blade came into appearance as a result. Then, red and blue magic characters began to flow and glimmer on the surface of the blade and its hilt. Break! Shi Mu issued a loud shout as he brandished his arms. 7 layers of overlapping stick shadows emerged in front of his body like a mountain. Then, they smashed against the black cage. Bang! A series of loud rumbling sound rang out in the air. Multiple waves of blistering hot air current and strong gust of wind exploded on the black cage. Then, they turned into a circle of shock waves, and started to roll up in a violent manner. The magic characters on the surface of the black cage flashed for some time in a violent manner. The cage went through a disastrous state in this process. And, the cage was gradually rooted and dispersed. It then changed into a plume of black smoke. Bai Xiaofeng witnessed this scene before his eyes, and his jaws dropped in shock. He was left thunderstruck for a moment even though he was the leader of this group. Then, his stature flashed and he rushed towards the courtyard's entrance. He didn't even pay attention to his subordinates who were lying on the ground in the courtyard. He was about to reach the entrance. Suddenly, the half-moon-shaped blade light darted towards him from behind. It was blazing with fiery red flames. Bai Xiaofeng whirled around, and infused his real qi into his arms. Then, he violently brandished the dazzling silver spear he held. The silver spear's shadow changed into several silver leopard heads. Then, those leopards turned towards the half-moon-shaped blazing blade light to receive it head-on. A few chi-chi sound resounded. The silver leopards were slashed into 2 pieces as they collided with the half-moon-shaped blade light. After that, they were engulfed by the roaring flames of the blade. Boom! Then, the half-moon-shaped blade light struck the silver spear in Bai Xiaofeng's hand. The silver spear was shaken up, and sent flying from his hand as it received this powerful jolt. Afterwards, a cloud of blazing flames soared into the sky. And, Bai Xiaofeng's stature was thrown backwards with a formidable force as this happened. In fact, even his clothes were torn and tattered in this process. The real qi within his body that had been protecting him all along had been exterminated by the impact. He heavily fell to the ground. He tried to get up, but a spurt of blood gushed out of his mouth instead. Shi Mu then carried the extended back on his shoulder. After that, he walked and arrived in front of him at a moderate pace. Then, he said, "I won." so, don't you have something to tell me, Your Excellency? No. I don't know what Your Excellency wants to know from me. I'll share everything I know. Bai Xiaofeng swallowed a mouthful of saliva. He then began to talk in a stammering voice. After some time, Shi Mu stood still with the extended blade on his shoulder. A pensive look could be seen on his face. He then turned around and walked in the direction of his room. He had learned some anecdotes about the Ascension to Immortality ceremony from Bai Xiaofeng. This information was different from what he had learned from Jin Xiaochai. Shi Mu now wanted to scoop out some more information. The Transcending Heaven Immortal cult used to hold this grand ceremony once in every 30 years. All large sects of the Lu Shan kingdom were eligible to participate in this ceremony. In addition, various other sects of the surrounding small nations and the aristocratic family of the entire mainland could also choose to send their disciples to attend this ceremony. Those sects whose disciples were chosen to attend this ceremony would be entitled to receive endless benefits. And, their status would also rise dramatically as a result. A number of disciples were sent by their sects. But, only a handful of disciples were filtered out to attend this ceremony. However, a few of them who possessed exceptional intelligence and innate qualities might choose to stay in the Transcending Heaven Immortal cult. It was said that the cult would provide them all kinds of natural resources and ancient books of cultivation arts to facilitate their practice. Moreover, these disciples would also receive a myriad of magic tools and valuable treasure from the cult. These resources were considered far beyond the imagination of the outside world. Furthermore, the cult might bestow some of the precious treasure and resources to their respective sects. And, these items weren't easily attainable outside. Therefore, each and every sect in the Eastern Territory would rack their brains and explore all means to send their disciples to this ceremony. Consequently, the number of participating disciples had continued to increase every time this ceremony was held. Hence, the Transcending Heaven Immortal cult came up with a rule. Each sect must pay a bountiful quantity of expensive spirit stones for each disciple it wanted to send. A large number of small sects of aristocratic families were blocked outside the door as a result of this rule. However, most of the natural resources granted by the Transcending Heaven Immortal cult were utterly precious. In fact, they were far beyond the value of the spirit stones they would have to submit. Therefore, most of the sects still took pleasure in this. Bestial Mountain sect was one such sect. There were obviously many sects that chose not to attend the Ascension to Immortality ceremony. The Heavenly Demon sect was also one of them. This sect was situated in the northern part of the mainland. The Bestial Mountain sect's disciples who lay in the surroundings had also regained their consciousness by now. And, they immediately flew away from Shi Mu's courtyard under Bai Xiaofeng's leadership. The petite man and the dark-skinned man still stood on guard at the hotel's entrance. Their faces flushed red as they heard the clamorous sound inside the courtyard. It seemed like they had failed to flatter these beastly robed men. This obviously meant that they couldn't demand some monetary rewards as they had initially planned. These two men waited for them for quite a while. But, the result was disappointing since Bai Xiaofeng and his subordinates dashed away from the scene in a distressed condition. And, these two men's complexion turned ashen as a result. The next day, Shi Mu left the room along with the parrot. He stepped out of the hotel, but only to find the elderly town chief outside. The chief stood with the support of a petite man's arm. He seemed to be waiting for Shi Mu in a respectful manner. Dozens of townspeople also stood with him in front of the hotel. This trivial old man is here to see off the righteous man Shi. The elderly chief pushed away the petite man as he saw that Shi Mu had appeared. He then moved 2 steps forward, bent down, and greeted him with veneration. Shi Mu acted as if he hadn't heard his words. He instead swept his vision over the people who gathered there. Then, his vision affixed itself on the petite man and a dark-skinned youth for a moment. The two men felt a slight chill running down their spines. Their backs had gotten drenched in cold sweat within a split second. And, their legs had also started to tremble with fear. It's hard to differentiate the good from the evil. Cai crooked its neck as it mumbled. Shi Mu retracted his vision. He then walked past the elderly chief without speaking anything. And soon, he had drifted away from everyone's sights. Shi Mu stopped at a crossroad outside the mountain town after some time. Shi Tou, you are far more powerful than those bestial mountain sect's useless weaklings. Why didn't you kill them and rob their spirits' stones? They have stayed here for so long. They must have dug up a lot of spirits' stones by now. Think about it, how exciting it is, ah! The parrot flapped its wings. Its eyes shimmered as it mumbled these words. Do you understand that killing them and grabbing their things could provoke them? Do you want to make me deal with their entire sect alone? Shi Mu patted the parrot's head with his finger as he replied. I am there with you. I'll ensure that you grab every single one of them. No one could slip away and disclose this information to anyone. The parrot patted its chest with its wings and said. Oh, if some of them display Earth-grade escaping technique, can you still go and find them? Shi Mu asked. Wait for me to grow to the 3rd level, humph, the parrot replied in an unwilling manner. At nightfall, layers of clouds were scudding across the sky, they looked like fish scales. A round disc-shaped moon hung in midair. But, these clouds gradually veiled the moon, and blocked its silvery radiance. This added a little mystery to this tranquil night. There was a lofty mountain peak that stood upright. It seemed as if it was soaring to the sky. It was surrounded by uninhabited and desolate lands. Intermittent bursts of metal clanging sound could be heard at the foot of this peak. Two silhouettes were interlaced and staggering back and forth in the open space near the peak. They were very fast, so much so that their statures seemed to be flickering. These two silhouettes were Shi Mu and Yan Luo. Shi Mu had stimulated his real qi to its maximum limit at this time. His body was wrapped in a layer of dark red light. He held the black blade in one hand, and a short stick in the other. The blade lights and the stick shadows cascaded down toward Yan Luo like a surging tide. Shi Mu had launched an overwhelming offensive attack. But, Yan Luo merely waved its bone spear in a casual manner to confront such a breathtaking attack. And, Shi Mu's fierce and incomparably formidable attack was warded off in a rather effortless manner. In fact, Yan Luo didn't budge an inch from the beginning to the end. Moreover, Yan Luo didn't miss the slightest chance to attack whenever Shi Mu's attack revealed the slightest of gaps. Its bone spear would drill into the gap like a poisonous dragon. It was very fast and relentless, so much so that it would often throw Shi Mu into a state of panic. Shi Mu narrowed his eyes after some time, and his eyes got smeared with a touch of golden color. After that, he wielded the short stick at a lightning speed, and a fan-shaped shadow streaked across the air. He then struck Yan Luo's bone spear in a precise manner. And, the bone spear was left to shake, and nearly flew out of Yan Luo's hand. A bright radiance appeared in Shi Mu's eyes. Then, his body fired towards Yan Luo. And, the black blade he held in his hand flared up vehemently. Shua shua! Two half-moon-shaped blade lights darted out, and slashed towards Yan Luo's chest. The soul flame in Yan Luo's eyes slightly flickered. Then, it took a step back, and moved its bone spear. Then, it started to brandish the bone spear up and down a few times. It seemed like a dragon that was floating in the air. A layer of faint white light bubbled up on the surface of the bone spear. And, the spear drew a number of sparkling silver traces in the air as it was brandished. It also gently touched the two blade shadows in this process. The two blade lights deviated from their path as a result, and brushed past Yan Luo's body. Shua! Suddenly, the bone spear in Yan Luo's hand galloped towards Shi Mu in a fierce manner. It changed into a fuzzy spear shadow halfway, and arrived in front of Shi Mu in a flash. Shi Mu's complexion changed. He was about to ward off the attack. But, the bone spear again underwent a change from a straight thrust into a horizontal sweeping shot. It then bombarded on Shi Mu's waist. Shi Mu issued a loud shout. The black blade and the short stick danced wildly in his hand. Several intersecting layers of blade light and stick shadows emerged in a crisscrossed manner. And, they immediately formed a layer of shield around his body. Yan Luo tightened its grip on the bone spear, and gently shook its arm. The spear shadow trembled violently. Then, it swept into the blade and the stick's shadows. Shi Mu only felt that a fuzzy shadow flashed before his eyes. He didn't even get enough time to respond. Suddenly, a vigorous force surged up from his waist. And then, his body was sent flying high up in the sky. Yan Luo received its spear and stood still. It didn't continue to pursue him. Shi Mu was thrown several feet backwards in the air. Then, his body crashed to ground heavily as the wisp of this formidable strength dissolved. His chest moved up and down severely for some time. Wonderful, it was truly wonderful, a sharp voice sounded. A parrot with multicolored feathers stood on a stone not far away. It fluttered its wings, raised its neck, and exclaimed loudly. Shi Tou, you are extremely weak. It's been more than once now. In fact, you get defeated by Boss Yan Luo every time you fight. Cai shifted its vision and said. Shut up. I will pull out some feathers from your body if you blabber again. Shi Mu coldly snorted. He then stood up. But, his complexion still looked somewhat pale. The plucking of his feather was the scariest thing for this parrot. Therefore, it covered its mouth with its wing as soon as it heard Shi Mu's words. And, it didn't dare to speak a single word after that. I feel terrified and alarmed every time I fight with you. Shi Mu patted the dust off his clothes. He then turned around, looked at Yan Luo as he said. Yan Luo's last blow had swept him several feet away, and had been sufficient to crush the real qi within his body. But, the strike surprisingly didn't render any injury to his body. In fact, even the slightest of damage hadn't been caused to his clothes. Shi Mu had been summoning Yan Luo whenever there was moonless night over the course of this journey. He would then practice martial arts with it in an attempt to strengthen his physical strength. And, he felt that the effect was indeed remarkable. He had begun to comprehend the depths of the Gale Force blade art and the art of 7 killer sticks better with each passing day. His stick art had been greatly benefited with this practice. He was now able to display the 7 killer sticks very conveniently. In fact, his moves had become as natural and graceful as floating clouds. Shi Mu felt that the promotion of his person martial skills was great. But, the promotion of Yan Luo's martial skills seemed to be even more astounding. Have I made some progress this time? Shi Mu looked at Yan Luo and asked. Yan Luo threw a glance at Shi Mu, but didn't speak anything. Good. Shi Mu smiled bitterly. Yan Luo turned around, and its body started to emit black smoke. Yan Luo apparently wanted to return to the dead spirit world now. Yan Luo, wait a minute. Shi Mu's eyes slightly moved. He then opened his mouth and called out to stop Yan Luo. He waved his hands and a bright red flower appeared in his hand out of thin air. That flower looked very similar to lotus flower. It was exuding soft fragrance. Its petals were also smeared with a few drops of water. All these features made the flower look very tender and exquisite. I think you are fond of flowers. I plucked this one during the day. Shi Mu gazed towards Yan Luo's head. He had once seen a green flower inserted on its head. But, that flower had gotten crumbled because of Shi Mu. Shi Mu's eyes slightly moved again. Then, they immediately regained their calmness. The soul flame in Yan Luo's eyes flashed. It extended its hand to grab the red lotus. But, it was left empty-handed since its hand landed in empty space. Shi Mu's storage ring had exuded a streak of light, and the lotus flower had disappeared from his hand as a result. Chapter 225, Exchanging Flowers. Translator, Novel Saga Editor, Novel Saga. Suddenly, the soul flame brightened in Yan Luo's eyes. It then raised its head, and looked towards Shi Mu. The black smoke around its body had also somewhat thickened. In addition, a whirlwind had also begun to originate around its body. Then, Yan Luo's hand moved, and slowly raised the bone spear. Don't be impatient. I can give you this flower. But, you will have to exchange your green flower for this one, Shi Mu said. Then, he waved his hand and the red lotus appeared in his hand again. He then pointed at the green flower that was inserted in Yan Luo's head. Yan Luo's soul flame twinkled twice, it seemed like it was somewhat hesitant. But, its hesitation subsided as its eyes fell on the flower that was in Shi Mu's hand. It took down the green flower from its head, and tossed it towards Shi Mu. And, it clamped its hands to catch the red lotus at the same time. Shi Mu hurriedly caught the green flower. He felt an ice-cold sensation in the petals of this flower. This feeling was similar to the one he had experienced before. His heart brimmed with exhilaration. He then sized up the green flower in a careful manner. He then raised his head. But, he noticed that Yan Luo had already returned to the dead spirit world. Only a few wisps of black smoke were floating in the air. But, they also disappeared quickly. His corners of the mouth moved, and he let out a sigh. He felt a little ashamed in the depth of his heart. He then shook his head, and tossed this thought out of his mind. The Lu Shan kingdom was close at hand. So, he would have to experience many hardships from now on. Therefore, he'd need to enhance his strength as soon as possible. Shi Tou, what is this flower? Cai came over, and landed on Shi Mu's shoulder. It's a good thing. Shi Mu didn't explain anything further to Cai. He then received his black blade and short stick. After that, he walked to one side, and sat down beside a boulder. There's something important that I need to do. So, I'm handing over the security part to you, Shi Mu threw a glance at Cai as he said. This is such a troublesome thing, Cai complained. But, it still spread its wings and flew up. Shi Mu looked up towards the sky, and his lips creased into a smile. The layers of clouds that had been in the middle of the sky had dissipated. And, this had gradually revealed the bright moon in the sky. The moonlight was sprinkling its silver radiance on the ground in the vicinity. And, it seemed as if it was bathing the earth below. There was a straight mountain peak not far from him. It looked like a gigantic stone pillar that was piercing the sky. The mountain peak appeared very vigorous and majestic even though it wasn't that lofty. This small mountain peak had been named Small Heavenly Peak by the local people. And, the fact was that this name seemed quite befitting. Shi Mu gazed at the mountain peak for some time. Then, he retracted his vision. And, his eyes again fell on the green flower in his hand. A beam of green light was flowing on the surface of that flower. Shi Mu's eyes flashed as he cautiously plucked out a petal with his fingers. Pop! The flower petal crumbled into pieces as soon as it was separated from the flower. Then, those fragments transformed into a tiny wisp of green airflow. After that, a spurt of bright light flashed on Shi Mu's palm. Then, his magic power seeped out through his body, and wrapped around the green air current. The green air current issued a whiz sound as it came in contact with his magic power. Then, it integrated with the magic power. Shi Mu closed his eyes, and stimulated his soul to guide this magic power. He then absorbed the magic power into his body. Suddenly, a stream of yin attribute cold qi flowed through his meridians, and wandered throughout his body. And, it eventually integrated into his lower abdomen. Shi Mu opened his eyes after a moment. And, a hint of happiness flashed through his eyes. He sensed that his magic power had increased exponentially, and this was just like he had expected. He had now reached the middle of the art of accumulating spirit power's 7th stage. Shi Mu sucked in a deep breath, and suppressed his excitement. Then, he pulled out another green petal. In the dead spirit world, the sky was covered with a curtain of eternal gloominess. There was a basin in the vicinity of a black and lofty mountain peak. The peak was hundreds of feet in height. Suddenly, a plume of black smoke emerged in the center of this basin out of thin air. It was followed by Yan Luo's silhouette that floated out from within. The red lotus could be seen sticking out on top of its head. There was a pool near the basin. Some faint red substances could be indistinctly seen in that pool. It seemed as if it was a deep water pool. 50 or more skeleton soldiers stood near the pool. Their bodies were covered with a suit of bone armor. They seemed to be guarding something. Suddenly, they saw that Yan Luo had appeared. So, they walked over and stood behind Yan Luo. Yan Luo beckoned with its hand, and those skeletons went to one side. There was an open area near the pool. But, the ground was piled up with large quantities of bones and skeletons. In fact, they seemed to be almost 100 in number. Yan Luo remained standing in the same place for a moment. Then, it shifted its vision towards that black mountain. The top of the mountain peak was shrouded in a layer of dark grey fog. The dense fog made it difficult to see the appearance of the summit from the distance. However, a trace of heavy pressure could be faintly felt there. Yan Luo then withdrew his vision, and walked over to the side of those skeletons' corpses. The soul flame flickered in its eyes in a severe manner. Then, a wisp of soul flame flew out from its mouth, and submerged into a skeleton's head that lay on the ground. Suddenly, a little green light gleamed in that skeleton's eyes. Then, that green radiance changed into 2 green soul flames. After that, the skeleton on the ground showed a little movement. And, it soon started to assemble its body parts by itself. It had soon taken the form of a complete human skeleton. The skeleton then moved its hands and feet a few times. After that, it walked to the side, and stood beside those 50 skeleton warriors. Afterwards, Yan Luo took a step, and stood by the side of another pile of skeletal bones. The number of the skeleton warriors who stood upright on their feet had reached 70 after a long time. However, the brightness of Yan Luo's soul flame had dimmed by a margin. Yan Luo finally came to a stop. It then arrived at the side of the deep water pool. It was about to jump into it. But, its body suddenly stiffened. Yan Luo had seen its reflection in the water. And, it had noticed that the red lotus that was inserted in its head had already withered. In fact, it had turned into a withered branch-like grey thing. Yan Luo was left dumbfounded for a moment. Then, it removed that withered thing from its head. After that, it issued a long and soundless shout, and stamped its foot in a fierce manner. Its soul flame also showed a burst of fluctuations. Yan Luo returned to its normal state after some time. It threw the withered flower that it held in his hand, and plunged into the pool. The last piece of green petal had also turned into a stream of cold air half an hour later. Then, it integrated into Shi Mu's body under the guidance of his magic power. Shi Mu opened his eyes, and the 2 faint rays of light were emanated from his eyes. His face beamed with happiness. He had absorbed the entire green flower. And, his magic power had surprisingly reached the peak of the 9th stage. He was only a step away from stepping into the star-grade magician's realm now. However, his magic power had basically depended on some external objects. So, it was somewhat unstable and difficult to control. In fact, it was far inferior to the stable magic power Shi Mu had previously accumulated from the moon-swallowing art. However, this wasn't a big issue. Shi Mu was confident that he could control this newly accumulated magic power if he got some time. He took a long and deep breath, and suppressed his overwhelming excitement. Then, he raised his head and looked towards the bright moon in the sky. An idea crossed his mind. And, he immediately exhibited the posture of the moon-swallowing art. He entered the dreamland after some time, and found himself incarnated into the white ape. The silver radiance of the moonlight began to fall and integrate into the white ape's body. Meanwhile, Shi Mu sized up the surrounding area. He found that this place was different from the previous one. The white ape sat cross-legged on the top of a horizontal mountain peak at this moment. The surface of the mountain was dark green in color. It looked like a gigantic stone pillar that soared high into the sky. This mountain peak. Shi Mu felt a little surprised. The appearance of this skyscraping mountain peak looked somewhat similar to that small mountain peak. There was a presence of an extremely rich spiritual energy in the vicinity of this towering mountain peak. In addition, the mountain was laden with numerous luxuriant trees that were unusually tall. Their gigantic height reminded Shimu of the trees he had seen in the barbarian wasteland. The white ape sat on a boulder. Many beasts could be seen in the vicinity. Wolves, bears, tigers, lions, and so on. These beasts were intently gazing towards the white ape who was fully absorbed in absorbing the moonlight. However, their faces were revealing a hint of veneration. A few of them were quick-witted. So, they had imitated the white ape, and had assumed the moon swallow art's posture. But, it was only natural that they couldn't absorb the moonlight. There were rolling mountain ranges near this lofty peak. But, they weren't as high as this towering peak. The forest on these mountains looked scarce and desolate. In fact, it gave off the ambience of the barbarian's wasteland. Moreover, a few volcanoes could be seen not far from this lofty mountain peaks. And, they seemed connected to each other. They would often puff out a plume of black smoke toward the sky. In addition, they would also spout bright red magma from time to time with a loud thundering sound. There were hundreds of beasts in the vicinity. But, they seemed accustomed to these volcanoes, so much so that they didn't even pour a glance towards them. A little time passed. More and more moonlight radiance was converging into the white ape's body now. It gradually started to seem as if the white ape's body was shrouded in a layer of faint silver smoke. The white ape's body suddenly exuded a dazzling white light at this moment. Then, it raised its head skywards, and issued a whistle. The ape's whistle was similar to the sound of a billowing wave, and it immediately proliferated in all directions. In fact, the sound wave even set off faint ripples in the air. The surrounding beasts also heard this sound. And, they felt as if a steel awl was drilling into their mind. The surrounding beasts issued howls of anguish as a result. Then, they put their hands behind their head, and lay prone on the ground. The white ape's long and loud whistle suddenly stopped. The layer of light shrouding its body also faded away. The moonlight that was converging into its body suddenly took the shape of a huge ape behind its back. Its entire body was white. It was dozens of feet tall, and it looked extremely powerful. After that, a pair of white wings impressively grew on the ape-like shape. It then stretched to unfold its wings. But, it seemed as if the wings still had room for growth. The white ape opened its eyes, and a pair of golden pupils fired two beams of golden light. After that, the white ape stood up and issued a low roar. The magic shadow behind its body flashed. Then, it submerged into the ape's body, and disappeared without a trace. Bang! A pair of white wings sprouted on the back of the white ape. It looked as if they were the real thing. Then, the wings flapped, and the white ape took off into the sky. It then started to hover in the sky freely, just like a bird. The surrounding beasts issued a roar out of excitement when they witnessed this scene. Then, they fell on the knees, and faced skywards towards the white ape. The white ape revealed a contented facial expression as it saw the actions of the hundreds of beasts below. Then, it began to issue roars. And it seemed as if it was showing off its strength. It then hovered back and forth the lofty mountain peak, and took a few laps. Some time passed, and it seemed like the white ape had shown off to its heart content. It no longer paid attention to those beasts. Instead, its vision drifted towards the nearby volcanoes. A thoughtful expression flashed through the ape's eyes. Then, it spread its wings and flew toward the nearest crater. Then, it flew into the crater. Shimu was within the white ape's body. He suddenly felt the hot and rich fire attribute spiritual aura around his body. A huge lake of magma appeared in front of the white ape. However, this brought a trace of excitement in its eyes. It retracted its wings, and jumped into the magma. There was nothing but darkness in front of Shimu's eyes. But, he woke up from the dream the next moment. He had returned to his own body. The sky had already regained its brightness by now. The moon had also slid down the western horizon. Only a faint shadow of it could be seen. Shi Mu was blankly gazing into the distance as he tried to recall the situation he had just seen in the dream. This wasn't the first time he had experienced a different dreamland while practicing the moon-swallowing art. It seemed that he sometimes entered the dreamland based on his own thoughts and feelings. However, these dreams didn't seem to have any special significance. In fact, these dreams were only useful for the moon-swallowing art and sun-swallowing art. Shi Mu pondered for a moment. Then, he shook his head and tossed away this senseless thought from his mind. He then stood up and gazed into the western horizon. The hint of a complicated look flashed through his eyes. This was the direction of Heavenly U City. Chapter 226, Ascension to Immortality Auction. Translator, Novel Saga Editor, Novel Saga. A month or so later. It was noontime. The scorching sun was shining high up in the sky. The sky was clean, and it seemed as if it had been bathed in blue color. There was no cloud in the sky as far as the eye could see. An area of dozens of acres of woods was scattered on either side of the 10-feet-wide road. The luxuriant growth of branches and foliage were adequate enough to render a cool and refreshing feeling. A luxurious horse-drawn carriage was parked on the left side of the woods. It was drawn by 2 pure white and graceful horses. And, a grey-robed stab lemon was feeding water and fodder to these horses. 20 or more people could also be seen around the horse cart. They were either in a standing or a sitting position. They seemed to be guarding the carriage. Their eyes were smeared with a touch of vigilance. Most of these people had blood stains over their bodies. But, their wounds had been bandaged. These people could be seen in small groups of 2 or 3 people at this moment. They were eating food while sitting on the ground. There was a huge tree not far from the carriage. A tall and black-robed young man was resting against this tree trunk. His eyes were closed, and his arms were crossed across his chest. 2 long weapons were crossed on his back in an intersecting position. They were wrapped in a piece of black cloth. This young man was Shi Mu. However, his shoulder was empty at this moment since Cai didn't seem to be around him. A handsome man walked over to Shi Mu's side from another tree at this time. This man seemed to be in his 30s. This man was clad in a white robe. He had sword-like sharp and straight eyebrows over his vivid eyes. A piece of silver cloth was wrapped around his forehead. His smooth and dark red hair was hanging on his back. They were left loose around his shoulder. These features gave off an aura of a graceful yet manly beauty. Elder Brother Lu, do you have any idea how far we are from the Heavenly U City? Shi Mu opened his eyes as he heard the sound of footsteps. He then asked. It should be roughly 1 month of a journey to reach there. The handsome man replied as he arrived under a tree that wasn't far from Shi Mu. He then similarly leant against the tree trunk and asked, "Oh, that's correct. Brother Shi has stepped into the Xian Tian realm at such a young age. Could it be that you are heading to Heavenly U City to attend the Ascension to Immortality ceremony? Brother Lu is making fun of me. I don't have such an important reason. I'm only traveling there to gain knowledge and enrich my experience." Shi Mu shook his head. It seems like just like me, Brother Shi is also going to the Ascension to Immortality auction, Luan said. Ascension to Immortality auction. Shi Mu gawked. Oh, Brother Shi doesn't know about this auction. I would appreciate if you could give me some more details. Actually, this isn't considered a secret matter. A greater part of the talented disciples of the Eastern continent converge to participate in this ceremony every time it is conducted. Moreover, many people rush over to observe and emulate. This obviously contributes to the unprecedented grand event that is held once in every 30 years in the Heavenly U City. The Heavenly Wu Chamber of Commerce is the best trading house of the Liu Shan Kingdom, and they hold the inauguration of the Ascension to Immortality ceremony. After that, the Ascension to Immortality Hall holds a grand auction. It is said that a person is likely to get everything he wants to buy in this auction. But, there is just a little catch. this ascension to immortality auction doesn't accept the silver coins or paper money. It only accepts spirit stones, the handsome man explained with a smile. So, it's like this. Thank you so much for sharing this information, Brother Lu. An idea cropped up in Shi Mu's mind as he heard the handsome man's words. He wanted to ask something else as well. But, a tumultuous sound suddenly transmitted from the direction of the luxurious horse cart. The two men shifted their gaze towards the source of the sound. They saw that the carriage's door was open. And, a well-dressed young boy was getting down the carriage. He seemed to be a 12 or 13-year-old kid. The boy then started to walk over to Shi Mu and the handsome man with the support of the arm of a middle-aged man who had a dignified expression on his face. There was a majestic aura around that dignified middle-aged man's body. He was surprisingly a Xian warrior. He was also the leader of this convoy. However, the young boy looked very frail and insignificant in contrast. He didn't exactly have a thin and weak stature. But, his complexion looked slightly pale. And, he looked a little shy. But, there was a trace of stubbornness hidden behind his eyes. Shi Mu and the handsome man stood up when they saw this. Our young master Hong insisted on personally expressing his gratitude to you two honorable men. The middle-aged man supported the young boy, and arrived in front of these two men. The two then stood firm as he started to speak. His sound was sonorous and brimming with energy like the sound of bells. Shi Mu and the handsome man were dumbfounded. They couldn't help but pour a glance at the young boy. This was the first time that they had seen this boy outside the carriage. Our convoy was attacked a few days ago. But, you two gracious benefactors extended support and rescued us. I'm truly grateful to you two for lending a hand in this time of emergency. And, thank you for rescuing this young Hong's life. Please accept this young Hong's greetings. The skinny boy tried to break himself free from the middle-aged man's support. Then, he walked towards Shi Mu and the other man, and greeted them. Young Master Hong, it was nothing but a chance encounter. Besides, it was our fate that brought us together. The handsome man moved his right hand, and gently supported the petite boy. Then, he replied with a soft smile. It was only a trivial matter. Young Master Hong doesn't have to mention it. Shi Mu also flashed a mild smile as he spoke up. The skinny young boy spoke a few words of gratitude for some time. But, his poor physical strength failed to hold him further in some time. Therefore, he returned to the carriage with the help of the dignified middle-aged man. Young Master Hong reminds me of my own younger self from childhood whenever I see him, the handsome man muttered once the young boy had left. Shi Mu couldn't help but size up this man as he heard these words. He couldn't understand how to associate this graceful and handsome man he was looking at with that frail and scrawny little boy who couldn't even properly walk without someone's support. As for how Shi Mu bumped into this handsome man, the young boy, and others, it was indeed a coincidence. Shi Mu had encountered this young boy's convoy when he was passing through a narrow and rugged valley one day. The convoy was under attack at that time. 20 or more black-robed masked men had besieged these people. 4 of the masked besiegers were Xian powerhouses. And, the rest of them were Hotian advanced stage warriors. Shi Mu had soon learned from the middle-aged man's angered wordings that they belonged to Heavenly Yu City. In fact, it had seemed they commanded a rather very dignified status in that city. However, those black-robed masked men didn't seem to care about their privileged status. Instead, they continued to launch waves of fierce offensive attacks on them. And, their actions had made it seem as if that horse-drawn carriage was their prime target. Shi Mu had then noticed that the middle-aged man and his group's members were desperately trying to resist them by putting their lives on the line. The middle-aged man possessed tyrannical strength. However, the other men of the convoy were obviously in a disadvantageous situation. That handsome young man had unexpectedly sprang up on the scene at such critical juncture. And, he had joined the convoy's team without demur, and had tied down one of the Xian powerhouses of the opposite party. His sudden action had greatly stabilized the situation. Shi Mu had been a bit hesitant in the beginning. But, he had then released Cai to fly for some time. After that, he drew his black blade and joined the side of the battling group. Then, he similarly took down another Xian Tian warrior of the besieging group. The convoy quickly gained the upper hand with the support of Shi Mu and the handsome man. And, the black-robed masked men eventually gave up and retreated. They also left several corpses of their Hotian warriors and a pile of weapons behind. Then, the middle-aged man proposed the handsome man and Shi Mu to become their escorts, and accompany their convoy to Heavenly Yu City. And, he promised that they would provide generous compensation for this task. The handsome man readily agreed since he had to travel in the same direction. But, Shi Mu hesitated a bit at first. However, he didn't refuse them in the end. Shi Mu became a member of this team as a result. He later came to know that this handsome man's name was Luan. Suddenly, a clamorous sound was heard. And, it pulled Shi Mu back from his memories. He raised his head, and realized that the convoy had completed the necessary preparations. So, they were ready to set out on the journey again. One particular night, several days later, the moon was obscured by a layer of black clouds. A curtain of darkness and silence was spread across the world. The luxurious carriage was parked on the side of a wilderness. A dozen tents of different sizes were scattered around the carriage in the periphery. Therefore, the appearance of this carriage surrounded by these tents looked similar to the moon surrounded by stars. Most of the people of the convoy had already fallen into a deep slumber, except for the two men who were the night guards. There was an ordinary-looking tent on the edge of the convoy. Shi Mu stood up and opened the flap of this tent. His body moved, and he walked in a certain direction in a silent and secretive manner. He arrived near a river bank after a quarter of an hour. The layers of clouds had also drifted away from the moon by this time. And, the soft silvery radiance of the moonlight had started to illuminate Shi Mu's face. Shi Mu examined the riverside surrounding grove at an electric fast speed. But, he didn't find anything abnormal around. He then arrived, and stood in the open space by the river. After that, he pinched his fingers and started to mumble something. He had been quite depressed for some time. It was because Yan Luo had been ignoring his summons ever since he had replaced his flower with Yan Luo's green flower. However, a plume of black smoke appeared not far from him soon after the spell was read this time. Shi Mu was overjoyed at this. This was the prelude which marked that Yan Luo would to appear here any moment. It seemed that Yan Luo had finally forgiven him. Soon, a human skeleton emerged from the black smoke. It held a bone spear in its hand. Its body moved and it walked out of the smoke. But, an unexpected scene unfolded the next moment. Yan Luo's stature abruptly turned fuzzy, and disappeared from the place. Shi Mu hadn't even been able to react to this when a mass of black smoke appeared not far from the grove. It was followed by Yan Luo's silhouette that emerged amid that smoke out of thin air. Then, a layer of white light began to flow on the surface of its bone spear. And, the bone spear changed into a misty white spear shadow the next moment. It was then thrust towards a particular place that was somewhere in the grove. A silver sword light scuttled out from the grove the next moment, and blocked Yan Luo's attack. Clang! A loud sound rang out. Two rays of light, one silver and other white, flashed. And then extinguished in a split second. Yan Luo's stature also halted. "Brother Shi, it's me," a familiar voice resounded. A white silhouette sprang out of the grove like a bolt of lightning as this voice was heard. This figure then flashed a few times as it advanced towards Shi Mu. A mass of black smoke flashed beside that white silhouette at this time. Then, a long and white bone spear stabbed towards him while trailing dozens of blurred shadows behind. A shrill ear-splitting sound rang out in the air like a shrewd laughter of an evil spirit. However, the white silhouette was also very nimble. It swayed and flashed a few times to evade the attacks Yan Luo had launched. After that, the white silhouette turned fuzzy again, and appeared in front of Shi Mu. A white light flashed on Yan Luo's body, and it seemed as if it was about to pursue the white silhouette once again. Shi Mu promptly used his mind to send an order to stop Yan Luo as he saw this. Yan Luo's gaze halted on the white silhouette that stood in front of Shi Mu. Then, the soul flame flickered in its eyes. Afterwards, Yan Luo turned around. A mass of black smoke enveloped its body completely. And then, it disappeared from the sight once again. Shi Mu smiled bitterly as he saw this. But, his eyes then shifted to Luan. He then said, "Brother Lu, are you tracking me?" "Brother Shi, don't misunderstand me. I couldn't fall asleep. So, I went out to the river bank to take a breath of fresh air. I didn't expect that I would bump into Brother Shi here. I had barely thought to come out and greet you. But, who would have thought Brother Shi's spirit pet would be so fierce? Its strike nearly compelled me into a big tumble as I tried to evade it," Luan explained while shaking his head. "Yes, it is," Shi Mu said. "He, Brother Shi's martial arts cultivation is remarkably profound. But, I didn't expect that he's also a soul magician. Speaking of which, I have a number of soul magician friends. I will introduce you to them if I get a chance. You might get a chance to enrich your knowledge and experience this way. Soul magicians are very rare as far as I know," Luan said with a smile. "Brother Shi, you rest assured. I will keep this matter locked in my heart forever." Luan didn't wait for Shi Mu's reply. He suddenly gave Shi Mu a meaningful wink and spoke up and lowered his voice. Luan seemed to have noticed that Shi Mu was reluctant to talk further. So, he found an excuse and left. Shi Mu remained standing in the same place. He gazed at Luan's silhouette as it gradually faded away, and the hint of a pensive expression appeared on his face. Chapter 227, Heavenly U City. Translator, Novel Saga Editor, Novel Saga. The Lu Shan Kingdom was the most powerful nation in the eastern continent, and it occupied most of the central core area of the entire eastern continent. It had a vast territory with 31 provinces and 108 prefectures under its command. The Heavenly U City was the capital city of the Lu Shan Kingdom. It was considered the most prosperous city in the Lu Shan Kingdom. In fact, it had the same status in the entire eastern continent. The Heavenly U City extended over a vast area. It was several thousands of miles in perimeter. This city was located in front of a river, and had its back against a mountain. So, it was difficult to launch an attack on this city. Moreover, it was also the convergence hub of the entire eastern continent. The city wall was almost 200 feet in height. The entire wall had been constructed with green-colored rocks, and each rock was 10 feet in height and 5 feet in width. Moreover, each rock looked like a piece of solid cast iron that couldn't be shaken. This magnificent city wall was similar to the body of a gigantic dragon. And, it stretched all along the eastern and western entrances to the city. The well-forested Mount Sanking covered the city from the northern side, while the southern entrance was guarded by the convenience of the 1,000 feet broad Xie River. Flags were fluttering on the city wall. There was a watchtower after every 500 feet on the city wall. Several fully armed soldiers were stationed on each watchtower. And, they kept a close watch over everything in the surrounding, so much so that didn't allow the slightest activity slip past their gazes. The morning sun had started to rise. And, the dazzling golden radiance of the sunshine was pouring down in torrents from the sky, and into the vast expanse blue water of the Xie River. Intermittent bursts of waves could be seen glistening in the glowing sunlight. 2 long queues of people had long been formed outside the majestic eastern gate. In fact, the queues were several miles long. Some of them were farmers who were carrying firewood on their shoulders. Some of them were warriors who were riding their horses. And, there were some craftsmen who were carrying large wicker baskets on their back, while some of them were merchants who could be seen sitting in their carts. All kinds of people present there, and the clamor of this crowd was constantly ringing in the air. The entry process had become even more severe at the city gate. Perhaps, it was because the time of ascension to immortality ceremony was around the corner. Many Taoist men dressed in blue robes were also present at the gates apart from ordinary soldiers who guarded the city gate. The demeanor of the Taoist men indicated that they commanded a high level of respect amongst these soldiers. These Taoist men held a round mirror in their hands. A golden-colored 8-trigram pattern was drawn on the back of the mirror. These mirrors would shoot out a faint golden light. Those who wanted to pass through the city gate were needed to go through waves of questioning by the soldiers. Moreover, they also had to pass through the golden light of these Taoists' people's trigram mirrors before they were allowed to enter the city. A group of 10 or more people could be seen advancing towards the city's gate from afar. There was a luxurious carriage in the center of this group, and it seemed as if it was encircled by these people. They were walking straight from the middle of 2 long queues. The people who stood in queues pointed their fingers, and shot an astounded look towards them as they saw them advance straight in the direction of the city's gate. Shi Mu was positioned at the end of this group. He couldn't control himself from sizing up the magnificent city wall as he walked towards it. He looked calm and composed on the surface. But, the fact was that he was little shocked deep in his heart. The heavenly Yu city was indeed spectacular. In fact, the Feng city didn't deserve to be called a city if it were to be compared with this heavenly Yu city. One could say that it was no better than a small town. Cai stood on Shi Mu's shoulder. His face was smeared with a touch of curiosity. And he was frequently sweeping his vision around out of curiosity. However, he was surprisingly very quiet. The fact was that Shi Mu had warned him in advance. He had threatened Cai that the soldiers would seize him if he dared to blabber while they entered the city. Then, they would pluck his feathers and stew him to make a cup of soup for their snacks. Therefore, he didn't want to make any clamor at this point of time. Luan was walking beside Shi Mu. He looked a little dull and weak like a feeble cloud in light wind. A distracted look could also be vaguely seen on his face, and it seemed as if he was caught up in his train of thoughts. Shi Mu and his group were still 20 feet away from the city gate. Suddenly, a seemingly ordinary man with thin and tall stature was stopped by the round mirror with the trigram pattern on its back. Then, a few soldiers came forward to arrest him. And, they gave him no explanations as they did so. "What have I done? Why do you want to arrest me?" the thin and tall man shouted as he resisted. Many people who stood in the queues revealed a trace of surprise on their faces as they saw this scene. Shi Mu's gaze also got pulled towards the scene. Then, a man walked out. He seemed like a high-ranked military officer. He shouted at the thin and tall man to clear the way. "What's this noise about? This is an order from the Transcending Heaven Immortal Cult. Any person suspected owing to heresy is to be detained for interrogation without exception. And, any such individual will only be released after their identity is verified. We would rather grab an innocent than allow a guilty to slip by. And, those who disobey shall be killed on the spot." The tall and thin man's complexion turned ashen out of fright as he heard these words. However, he didn't dare to show the slightest resistance again. He was then taken away by 2 soldiers. Shi Mu didn't know what this word heresy mentioned by the opposite party referred to. But, he felt a formidable aura around the military officer when he shot a glance at him. It seemed as if he was a Xiantian primary stage powerhouse. It could be said that Xiantian warriors were revered as a protector of the nation's military in the Duchy Kingdom. But, they weren't assigned the topmost positions in the military. But, the military general of the Heavenly Yu City was a Xiantian-ranked warrior. There was a sharp contrast between these nations if this point was to be considered. Shi Mu and other pedestrians arrived close to the city gate. They were barely 100 feet away at this time. "You people over there, why you aren't following any of these 2 lines?" A soldier who was guarding the gate saw them approaching. He then pointed his finger in the direction of the convoy, and yelled out in a loud voice. A few surrounding soldiers and blue Taoist-robed men were about to step forward when they saw this scene. But, a dignified middle-aged man walked out from the side of the horse-drawn carriage. He had actually taken the initiative to move forward and welcome them. He then fished out a palm-sized golden token from his bosom, and held it up towards the military officer from afar. The military officer swept his vision over the golden token, and his complexion changed very drastically. He separated the soldiers from either side, and strode over. He then cupped his hands in obeisance towards the dignified middle-aged man, and said, "It's a senior messenger as it turns out. Let them pass." His voice had barely faded, and the complexion of the gatekeeper and those Taoist-robed men changed. They then quickly stepped aside to make way for this convoy. The luxurious carriage passed through the gate under the attention of other surrounding people. Shi Mu and others obviously accompanied the carriage, and entered the city gate. They didn't have to go through the interrogation process either. The first thing that seemed pleasing to eyes right after they entered the gate was a wide blue stone boulevard. It was large enough to accommodate 10 horses side by side. There was also a crossroad in the front, and it led to 3 directions. A number of people were shuttling back and forth on these roads. Suddenly, Luan walked over to the middle-aged man who was walking beside the carriage. He then cupped his hands towards him in obeisance and said, "Brother Lu, the convoy has safely arrived in the heavenly Yu city. There are some important things that I have to take care of. So, I'll take my leave. Brother Lu, wouldn't it be nice if you follow me to the mansion and take a little rest if you are not in a hurry? I could use some help around the heavenly Yu city. And, I can help you with some financial remuneration if there's an issue." The dignified middle-aged man urged him to stay. "Brother Lu is being formal. I genuinely have something important. So, it would become very inconvenient for me to stay," Luan replied with a smile. The middle-aged man noticed that Luan was firmly determined to leave. So, he didn't try to stop him. He instead took out one brocade sack from his bosom, and handed it over to Luan. Luan accepted it. Then, he turned around and bid his farewell to Shi Mu. He then blended into the stream of people, and disappeared into the vast sea of people. After that, Shi Mu also stepped forward, and bid his goodbye to the middle-aged man. The opposite party obviously tried to stop him as well. But, Shi Mu was also determined to leave. Therefore, he similarly rewarded Shi Mu for his services. Shi Mu received the brocade sack. He then swept his eyes over it, and saw that there was a dazzling silver middle-rank magic charm, and 10 primary-level spirit stones inside it. He couldn't help but feel delighted. This silver magic charm was the same one that Princess Huowu had given him when they were inside the portal of the brave warriors. It was a teleportation magic charm. He received the brocade sack into the vast earth ring. Then, he casually began to walk towards the street on the right-hand side. Meanwhile, the luxurious carriage continued to gallop towards the street at the front along with the rest of the people. Shi Mu wandered around the street for some time. And, he continued to observe the most prosperous city of the eastern continent. The city looked very lively with incessant hustle and bustle of people everywhere. Most of them were dressed in magnificently embroidered clothes. Luxurious carts and convoys with fully loaded goods could be seen shuttling back and forth. Small tradesmen could be found everywhere on the street. They would pull carts, and would try to sell their goods. There were rows of buildings of different heights on either side of the street. In addition, various kinds of shops could be seen everywhere. More and more shops had started to open even though it was early morning. However, they would start attracting customers in no time. However, the thing that made Shi Mu's heart flutter with excitement was that there were many 5- or 6-storied buildings around. He could see from afar that this city was crowded with many lofty buildings. 7- or 8-storied buildings could also be seen here. He could even see one small hill in the west. This hill was about 1,000 feet in height. Clouds and mist were curling around its summit. But, he could vaguely see a magnificent and vast stretched palace on it. 3- or 4-story tall buildings were considered very tall in a common city. But, they seemed to be a common sight here. Shi Mu couldn't help but think of the scenery he had encountered after he had left the wasteland. And, the scenery he had seen along the journey. He had seen numerous sparsely populated villages and towns everywhere in that desolate and infertile land. The originally rich spiritual aura in those mountains had somehow become dead and quiet. Even the vegetation had withered. In fact, even that small mountain town was rare to come by. However, the thing that he remembered the most was that there were vast stretched tombs outside many villages, so much so that many of the skeletons were still exposed under the sun. And, these features formed a sharp contrast to the hustle and bustle of this place. Shi Tou, let's go to that sweet-smelling building and have a meal. Cai is starving to death, the parrot's voice suddenly resounded in his ears. Cai's eyes had brightened up as he pointed his wings towards a nearby magnificent-looking restaurant. You had already gobbled up a lot of things before we entered the city. So, wait until noon. Shi Mu didn't pay attention to Cai. Humph, stingy fellow. Cai flapped his wings and flew away in an infuriated mood. Shi Mu didn't mind it either. He put away this thought, and began to stroll through hotels, shops, and other places. The parrot flew back after a while. Shi Tou, some people are performing a sideshow over there. It looks so exciting. Let's go to take a look at it, the parrot shouted as it hovered over Shi Mu's head. Shi Tou, some people seem to be selling precious stones. Those stones look so beautiful. And Shi Tou, quickly look over there. There's indeed something that seems very amusing. The incessant chattering from the parrot continued to ring until Shi Mu ended his first day tour in the heavenly U city. He had chosen a hotel before the sky had darkened. And, he had rented an independent small courtyard for his temporary stay. He came to realize something based on the information he had collected from today's exploration. Many disciples of various sects had arrived here to participate in the Ascension to Immortality ceremony like Ximen Shui had. And, they were arranged to stay in post houses that were distributed across the city. It was said that these post houses were specially set up by the Lu Shan kingdom for this grand ceremony. Moreover, there was a large number of such post houses in the heavenly U city since the size of the city was very big. Therefore, attempting to find a particular person in this city was similar to looking for a needle in a haystack. However, Shi Mu still had nearly 7 months of time before the Demon Yang ceremony would start. But, he only needed a span of 3 or 4 months to make it to Heavenly Demon Sect from the Heavenly U City. So, he had plenty of time on hand. In addition, he also learned from some shopkeepers that the Ascension to Immortality auction would begin only a month later. And, they would have some not-so-low-level evil ape's blood and essence to sell this time. This was great news for Shi Mu since he had been stuck in the bottleneck of the art of breeding a strong evil ape's 5th stage for a while. Therefore, his intention was to wait for the auction to begin. And, he would also inquire about Ximen Shui's whereabouts in this meantime. Chapter 228, Conspiracy and Arrangements. Translator, Novel Saga Editor, Novel Saga. Inside a secluded big house somewhere in the heavenly U city. The structure and appearance of the courtyard looked very obsolete. Many doors and windows looked old with paint flaking off the surface. A thick layer of dust had accumulated everywhere. The ground was covered with a layer of withered yellow leaves. It seemed like this house had been left uninhabited since a long time. However, the size, the layout of the entire house, and the fine and exquisite details on the eaves of the roof proved that this house must have been the former residence of a well-established and wealthy man. Moreover, a magnificent golden board "The world is limitless" could be seen in front of the house. So, it was clear that the owner shouldn't be an ordinary man. The period of dusk was approaching its end. And, the sky was gradually getting dark. A handsome young man stopped in this courtyard. He stood still with his eyes closed. It seemed as if he had sensed something. He seemed to be in his early 30s. He wore a pale white robe. A piece of silver cloth was wrapped around his forehead. This person was the same handsome man who had followed the convoy and had entered this city along with Shi Mu. He was Luan. The night breeze was blowing against his face. and his long scarlet hair was swaying in the breeze. In fact, it seemed as if they were dancing in the wind. Luan opened his eyes a moment later. His eyes looked as tranquil as the surface of the water. He observed the surrounding in a silent manner. After that, he lifted his foot, and walked over to a certain room which was in the east. He then shoved open the door, and walked in. The room was quite spacious. It was divided into two sides from the middle. All necessary items like a bed, tables, chairs, etc. were available in the room. The room looked simple, yet elegantly arranged. Luan went into the room. He then stretched his hand towards a spot near the bedside, and pressed it. Then, he whirled around. Kaka! A dull thumping sound was heard. The wall behind him suddenly split from the middle. And, it revealed a dark passage that seemed to be leading underground. Luan didn't hesitate. His stature flashed and disappeared into the passage. The passage wasn't long. So, Luan soon passed through the dark passage, and arrived in front of a bright secret room. This was a small room with the perimeter of a few feet. There was a tribute table in the middle, no other basic amenities or decorative stuff was present. 2 candles were placed on top of that tribute table. 5 motionless silhouettes could be seen on both sides of the room against the faint light of those candles. These people stood up as they saw Luan walk in. 3 of them were men, and 2 were women. One of these 3 men was a tall and sturdy black-dressed man, his face was painted with red color. The second one was an obese man who looked like a merchant. And, the third one was a young man with short and silver hair. One of the 2 women had a tall stature, and her face was hidden behind a veil. Another woman had an exquisite and petite figure, and she was clad in a fiery red dress. Big brother. These 5 people walked toward Luan in a respectful manner, and greeted him in unison. Luan didn't utter a single word. He walked past these 5 people, and arrived by the side of the central table. A cold and gloomy aura could be felt around his body. A black memorial tablet was enshrined on top of that tribute table. And, 4 seal characters were carved on top of it: Dong Fang Xian Tian. Ping! A muffled sound was heard. Luan knelt down in front of the tribute table. Nobody noticed when the silver cloth wound around his forehead had been pulled off. But, it had exposed one hook-like round and scarlet-colored crescent moon in the middle of his forehead. The other 3 men and 2 women also arrived behind Luan, and knelt down in a similar fashion. The atmosphere inside the secret room had turned sad and gloomy for a moment. Master's relative didn't agree. But, I still came. And, I will make them pay the price. The heavenly demon king will be unleashed upon this world. And, he would make the blood of these geniuses sprinkle over the sky of the heavenly U city. Thus, I will offer condolences to your soul in heaven with their souls. Luan spoke up in front of the memorial tablet. He then knocked his head thrice on the ground heavily. The leader may rest in peace. The 5 others also pressed their foreheads to the ground along with Luan. Everyone's face was smeared with the touch of a respectful expression. At nightfall, in the western side of the heavenly U city, there was a cluster of palaces on the top of a small but nearly 1,000 feet high hill. The largest one of them was the Golden Palace, and it looked quite striking. This palace was shrouded in a layer of 7-colored clouds and mist during the day. But, it would dazzle with magnificent golden light at night. In fact, this dazzling golden radiance could be seen in this dim light of night from every part of the city. The Transcending Heaven Immortal Cult of the Heavenly U City had established a religious camp here. The Transcending Heaven Immortal Cult was regarded as the national cult of the Lu Shan Kingdom. It had its branches spread across each and every city. But, the one established in the Heavenly U City was undoubtedly the largest among all. It also organized the Ascension to Immortality ceremony. However, people had divergent opinions about the whereabouts of the immortal cult's leader. Some people would say that the leader was in the depths of Mount Sanking that extended over thousands of miles. Some people would say that the leader could be found in the cult camp of the Heavenly U City. Some others would even say that the leader resided on a floating island. But, one thing was certain. The immortal cult's leader would come to the heavenly U-City every time this grand ceremony was held. Moreover, he would personally preside over the ceremony. At this time, in a certain side hall of the Golden Palace, an elderly man sat upright on the main seat. He was attired in a blue trigram Taoist clothing. The elderly man had a childlike face. But, his spirit power seemed very profound and formidable. He gave off an aura of immortality and extraordinariness on one hand. However, he also seemed like a newborn at the same time. An emaciated young boy with pale complexion sat on a chair on his right side. His facial expression looked as if he was in cramped conditions. A middle-aged man with dignified facial expression stood on another side. He was the same Xian Tian leader of Shi Mu's convoy. But, he had changed into a blue trigram's Taoist robe at this time. Young Hong, you have gone through many hardships over these past years. I've also heard that your convoy was besieged. But, you are in the heavenly U-City now, and you can consider it as your own home. You don't have to feel awkward here. You take a good rest for the time being. You can see your ancestor after 7 days. The elderly man's eyebrows looked kind and gentle as he said. The little boy didn't speak anything. He simply gave a nod. The elderly man called 2 young Taoist priests after a few more words were exchanged. They supported the young boy with their arms, and left the hall along with him. Send someone to give a message to Liu Shan's people. Young Hong is a descendant of a Taoist immortal. He should be properly placed. And, he shall be bestowed with the title of a prince. The elderly man turned towards the middle-aged and said once the young boy had left. I'll sincerely obey the leader's order, the dignified middle-aged man replied with deep veneration. Time rolled on, and several days passed in an instant. A grey-robed young man was slowly walking on a spacious bluestone street in the heavenly U-City. A parrot with feathers of multiple colors sat on his shoulder. The parrot was gazing around in a curious manner. This young man was naturally Shi Mu. This was the West Tong Ma Road of the heavenly U-City. It was considered the most bustling street in this city. The street seemed to be packed with the stream of people. And, various kinds of large roadside shops and restaurants could be seen everywhere on this street. However, Shi Mu looked too occupied to enjoy the hustle and bustle of the street at this moment. His brows were creased, and it seemed as if he was pondering over something. Shi Tiou, we have been walking since morning. I may die from exhaustion. We might as well take some rest up ahead. Cai shouted. Do you have to walk? Shi Mu extended his hand, and hit the parrot's head as he heard his words. Then, he raised his head and looked in the front. There was an attractive and lofty building in the front. It had a broad entrance hall and some luxurious decoration therein. It seemed to be a big restaurant. This restaurant appeared very outstanding and eye-catching even on this bustling street. The name Lucky House Restaurant was hung at the main entrance of the restaurant. It was written in a very artistic way. Shi Mu's heart moved. He had been busy since morning. He was indeed tired. So, he took a step to go in. There was still some time left before noon. So, it wasn't the lunchtime yet. Therefore, only a handful of customers could be seen in the restaurant. Sir, please come inside, the waiters welcomed him in a passionate manner as they saw him walk in. A huge parrot with colored feathers stood on Shi Mu's shoulder. Also, Shi Mu's manner of dressing looked a little strange. But, there was a majestic and stubborn imposing aura around him, and this left people to feel that they mustn't dare to despise him. Furthermore, all kinds of good and bad people had gathered in the heavenly U-City these days. And, Shi Mu had carried a bird on his shoulders. So, it wasn't surprising to say that it was similar to seeing a fierce tiger wandering on the street freely. Shi Mu came to a private room on the second floor under the guidance of that waiter. The layout of the room looked very exquisite. A windscreen was used between the tables along with pots of flowers to separate the tables from each other. It looked very peaceful. Only a dozen or more tables were arranged on the second floor. But, it didn't seem crowded. There were very few customers on the first floor. But, 4 or 5 tables were occupied by the customers on the second floor. I would like to have a cup of green tea with some snacks, Shi Mu sat down on a chair and said. And, I want to eat nuts, Cai shouted. The waiter was surprised to see Cai when he felt Cai's astonishing spirit power. Bring some nuts sort of snacks, Shi Mu said. The waiter complied. He stole a quick glimpse of Cai with astonishment. Then, he took his leave. He served a few dishes of exquisite nut snacks and a pot of fragrant green tea after some time. Shi Mu readily paid him a few silver notes. Then, he made the waiter withdraw. Cai tasted the snacks in high spirits. He also took a mouthful of green tea from time to moisten his mouth. But, there was no such excited and relaxed expression on Shi Mu's face. Instead, the trace of a thoughtful expression had its shade on his face at this moment. He had visited several post houses of the Ascension to Immortality ceremony in this city over these past few days to make inquiries. But, his efforts had gone in vain since he couldn't collect the slightest useful information. However, it wasn't surprising since the Heavenly U City had hundreds of such post houses. Perhaps, even 2 or 3 months of time wouldn't be sufficient enough to visit each one by one. An idea dawned on him. He thought that whether he should find someone to help him. Suddenly, a burst of clamorous sound interrupted his train of thoughts. Haha, Brother Joe's strength is amazing. So, he wouldn't face any problem in displaying his outstanding skills in the Ascension to Immortality ceremony. I would like to congratulate Brother Joe in advance for becoming an immortal and stepping into the League of Immortals. Brother Ge is very polite. All kinds of experts have converged to participate in this ceremony. So, my inconsequential skill set isn't worth mentioning at this point. Your Ge family's techniques are quite famous in the Lu Shan Kingdom. And, Brother Ge is already a Xiantian middle-level warrior. So, his chances of winning are much higher than mine. You are flattering me. Shi Mu's brows creased into a frown as he looked towards the source of this hubbub. He saw that 4 or 5 magnificent clothing young men sat around a table not far from his seat. They seemed to be in their 20s. They were talking and laughing so loudly that it seemed as if there was no one around them. However, there was the presence of a threatening imposing aura around these young people. They were surprisingly Xiantian warriors. In addition, their clothing made it seem that they belonged to some influential families, they perhaps held some special identity. Shi Mu's brows wrinkled as he listened to their interaction. These people ought to be the geniuses of their respective sects. And were here to take part in the grand ceremony. He glanced at them and withdrew his gaze immediately after. These youngsters from influential families continued to talk in a loud voice as if there was no one around. Their arrogant talks continued for some time. Afterwards, their thread of discussion gradually shifted to some other topics. Brother Shentu, you must be free in the afternoon. It is said that Huangshi shop wants to hold an auction. It would be a small-scale auction. But, it would be worth visiting. A tall and sturdy yellow-robed youth spoke up while looking towards a youth dressed in blue. Other people looked towards him in a similar fashion. The youth dressed in blue had a well-proportioned body, and he commanded a rather heroic spirit. No, I have some important things to take care of in the afternoon, the youth dressed in blue replied with a mysterious smile. Brother Shenta wants to go to the Jasper Street where a post house of the Ascension to Immortality ceremony is. I heard that a stunning beauty has shown up very recently. Therefore, he often visits that place these days, another young man said with a smile. Oh, what kind of a woman could set even Brother Shenta's heart on fire? The yellow-robed sturdy youth revealed a curious look. Chapter 229, To Meet an Old Friend Far From Home. Translator, Novel Saga Editor, Novel Saga. I have also seen her only once to be honest. Tisk tisk, it's indeed true that she's an angel-like gorgeous maiden. In fact, she's not inferior to Princess Uni of the Lu Shan Kingdom, who is widely known for her heavenly beauty. A few of the young men were fired up as they continued to talk about this topic. Shi Mu's brows creased into a frown. He drained the cup of tea in one gulp. Then, he got up and started to walk down the stairs. I have also heard that this woman has arrived in the heavenly U city barely half a month ago. I came to know about this from some guy who hails from a small sect in the coastal eastern part of the continent. Another voice was heard. Shi Mu's eyes flashed as he heard this sentence. He went back, and took his seat again. Brother Shentu, won't you introduce her to us if she is such a beauty? Could it be that you wish to enjoy alone? The sturdy yellow-robed young man laughed heartily. You don't know one thing about her, Brother Ge. This woman has rarely stepped out of her room ever since she has set foot in the heavenly U city. It's also said that this woman has had a cold and indifferent temperament towards others. In fact, you might not get to see her even if you stand at her door to meet her. Even Brother Shentu has suffered her closed-door treatment a few times. Some people have even bestowed her with a title, the Frost Fairy. Another young man laughed as he said. Well, I wasn't prepared for this during my previous visits. But, I'll go with full preparation this time, the blue-robed man snorted. He had said this while he had touched a ring between his fingers. Suddenly, a small purple and embroidered box appeared in his hand. He opened its lid, and a pair of pure and translucent green bracelets appeared before their eyes. A few magic characters were faintly engraved on the surface of those bracelets. They were emitting faint green rays of light. This item didn't seem like a low-ranked magic tool. The Shentu family is indeed a noble family. Some of your ancestors had even passed through the Ascension to Immortality ceremony and had gotten promoted to the realm of the immortals. Your family genuinely deserves to be called an influential family. This pair of jasper bracelets is equivalent to 2 pieces of middle-ranked spirit stones. But, Brother Shentu is going to use it to win over a woman's favor alone, the yellow-robed man spoke up in a somewhat strange tone. Hee, wouldn't it be a great idea if we go together today to have a look at that mysterious woman? A young man spoke up in a persuading manner. Fine then. I'll take a few of you along to enhance your knowledge and experience. Let's go. The blue-robed man closed the small box, and received it into his storage ring again. Then, he stood up and said. The other young men also stood up. They then walked down the stairs while talking and laughing. Shi Mu's heart skipped a beat. He stood up, and followed after them. Shi Tou, are you leaving already? Cai called out. However, Shi Mu didn't pay attention to him. He continued to walk fast, and arrived close to the staircase in an instant. Cai hastily flapped its wings, and flew up behind him. Those magnificently dressed disciples left the restaurant. Then, they began to walk along the street under the guidance of the blue-robed man. Shi Mu also followed after them, but kept a reasonable distance between them. He soon arrived at a secluded street after he had taken a few turns. However, those young men had stopped since they had caught Shi Mu following them. Hey boy, why are you following us? A young man with a somewhat gloomy facial expression walked over. He sized Shi Mu up and down in a malicious manner. I only happened to be walking on the same road, that's all. Besides, I don't have any desire to follow you guys, Shi Mu replied. Humph! Don't pretend to be naive. The fact is that you've been following us ever since we left the restaurant. And, you thought that we wouldn't notice it, the man with a gloomy expression countered. Is that so? I genuinely didn't notice, Shi Mu continued to play dumb. The trace of a furious look flashed through the gloomy-faced man's eyes. He took a step forward, and moved closer to him. What do you want? You want to fight? We aren't afraid of you people. Shi Mu didn't say anything. It was Cai who had opened his mouth and begun to shout. Brother Qin, Ascension to Immortality ceremony is around the corner. And, the Immortal Cult has already issued an order that prohibits any kind of fights within this city. So, don't pick a fight and violate the immortal cult's order. The blue-dressed man's gaze swept around. Then, he opened his mouth and said, "Well, boy, consider yourself lucky." The gloomy-faced man's eyes turned and shot a cold glance at Shi Mu. Then, he turned around and continued to walk again. The other people continued to walk towards the front. However, the sound of footsteps continued to reverberate from behind them again. Shi Mu had started to pursue them again, as if nothing had happened. "Boy! You're courting death," the gloomy-faced youth said in a furious manner. Other people's faces also darkened. "You people are free to walk on this road. We aren't blocking your way or obstructing your walk," Shi Mu replied. "This is the main road, and many people can walk side by side. You can't control where we should go and where not," the parrot yelled. The gloomy-faced youth was infuriated by this. And, a layer of faint green light bubbled up on the surface of his body. Suddenly, a palm pressed his shoulder. The gloomy-faced man's facial expression changed, and the pale green radiance also vanished from his body. The blue-dressed young man looked at Shi Mu in an intense manner and said, "I don't know who your excellency is, and where have you come from? But, I wish to remind you one thing: not everyone can offend somebody or violate the law here in Heavenly U City." "Thank you for reminding me, Your Excellency," Shi Mu cupped his hands in obeisance and replied with a smile. The blue-dressed man snorted coldly. Then, he continued to walk ahead while leading other people. However, Shi Mu still continued to walk behind them. Their group arrived in front of the gate of a secluded and quiet post house nearly half an hour later. 2 men were stationed at the gate for keeping watch. They wore the uniform of the immortal cult. The blue-dressed man and his companions took out a fist-sized jade token from their clothes. The guard glanced at them, and allowed them to pass without further questioning. "Hey young man, this place is the Ascending Immortal Hall's post house. Unrelated people mustn't approach it." A guard held out his hand, and blocked Shi Mu's body. Shi Mu creased into a soft smile. Then, a ray of light flashed in his hands and 2 spirit stones appeared before their eyes. Those 2 guards glanced at each other. The trace of an avaricious look flashed through their eyes. There was a small courtyard inside the post house. The blue-robed man and his companions had gathered there. The blue-dressed man's eyes were smeared with the trace of a burning hot look at the moment. He arrived before the door, and knocked on the door. "Shentu Guang has come, especially to pay a visit to the young lady. So, I would request you to show yourself once," the blue-dressed youth announced loudly. "Mr. Shentu, this girl isn't feeling well today. So, I would request you to return," a melodious voice sounded from inside. It seemed as if a black-naped oriole had flown out of the valley. "May I know what happened to the young lady? I have a little understanding of the medical profession. Also, I have carried a myriad of pills and magic charms along with me. I could look after you in all walks of life. So, I would request the young lady to not refuse this man who has come here from 1,000 miles away," the blue-dressed man replied. The other young men in the courtyard seemed to be sighing. The sound of footsteps spread from outside that small courtyard. It was followed by a silhouette that walked in. It was Shi Mu. There was a strange look on his face. It was because he had faintly heard this conversation from afar. He hadn't heard everything very clearly. But, the girl's voice had given him a feeling of familiarity. Could it be that? Shi Mu's heart stirred up with overwhelming emotions. The blue-dressed youth was about to say something. But, his brows wrinkled as he saw that Shi Mu had also appeared there. A squeak sound was heard at this moment. And, the door of that small courtyard was slowly opened. The blue-dressed man was exhilarated. And, he no longer paid attention to Shi Mu's arrival. Instead, he gazed towards the opening door with great excitement. He had fallen deeply in love with this beautiful maiden the first time he had seen her. And he hadn't been able to extricate himself from this feeling ever since. He had already visited this place 10 times in these past few days. But, this was the first time the opposite party had chosen to show herself on her own initiative. How couldn't this set his heart on fire? He saw that a gorgeous maiden stood at the entrance. She was clad in a light green dress. She had an elegant and exquisite appearance. Her beautiful neck looked slender and delicate. Her slender waist was tied with a pale white jade ribbon. These traits made her look like a heavenly fairy. Her incredible beauty left the surrounding young men unable to take their eyes off her. Shi Mu was left startled as his eyes fell on this young girl. This woman wasn't Ximen Shui as Shi Mu had originally guessed. But, he was familiar with this girl as well. She was actually Zhongxiu. Zhongxiu felt a little frustrated and helpless as her wonderful eyes swept over those young men. These people didn't seem to have an ordinary status. In fact, it wasn't good to offend them. Therefore, she began to find an excuse to drive them away. Her beautiful pair eyes were glancing around in a random manner. And, they suddenly stopped and rested on a seemingly ordinary grey-robed young man. However, she couldn't move her eyes away from him for some reason. The blue-dressed man's eyes had become even more fervent with excitement. He took a step, and moved towards her. He was about to open his mouth and say something since he wanted to take advantage of the opportunity. However, the beautiful maiden's stature flashed and changed into a green shadow. Then, she pounced towards Shi Mu. "Brother Shi!" A green light flashed in front of Shi Mu's body. Then, a green person's silhouette threw herself in Shi Mu's arm while carrying the whiff of a delicate fragrance. Lady Zhong, a jade-like warm and sweet-smelling woman, embraced him with her arms. But, Shi Mu couldn't understand how to react in this situation. This scene left the surrounding young men profoundly shocked. The blue-dressed man's facial expression turned pale. And, his eyes nearly blazed with raging flames as he glared at Shi Mu in a fierce manner. Boom! The blue-dressed man's body emitted a faint blue flame. Then, he shot the flame towards the surrounding. The surrounding people exchanged glances with one another. Then, they moved a few steps back. Their faces revealed a delighted look, and it seemed as if they were taking pleasure in this show. "Young fellows, an order has already been issued that has prohibited promulgating fights within the city. This is one of the post houses of the Ascending Immortal Hall. So, I will notify them in case you start a fight here. Then, they will deprive you of your qualifications of taking part in the grand ceremony," a voice resounded. Nobody noticed when a middle-aged man had appeared in front of that small courtyard's gate. He was attired in the uniform of Transcending Heaven Immortal Cult. But, he seemed far more handsome than those guards who stood outside this post house. Also, there was a trace of formidable aura around him that was similar to a Xian Tian-ranked warrior. The blue-robed man's complexion changed. The layer of blazing blue flame also disappeared from his body the next moment. Zhongxiu's complexion looked bright red as she loosened Shi Mu from her arms. She glanced towards the other men. Then, she pulled Shi Mu inside the small courtyard, who was still in a surprised state, and closed the door. "Well, let's go." The blue-robed man's complexion turned unsightly. He turned around in anger and walked away. Other people shrugged their shoulders since they had no other option left but to follow him. The middle-aged helplessly let out a sigh. He looked at the tightly closed door of the courtyard. Then, he turned around and departed. In the small courtyard, Shi Mu and Zhongxiu gazed into each other's eyes. But, they didn't speak anything for a while. A hint of blush could still be seen across Zhongxiu's face. Her eyes were smeared with a touch of bashful look. But, she was still gazing straight into Shi Mu's eyes. Cai glanced at Shi Mu. Then, he shifted his gaze to Zhongxiu. He then let out a yawn out of boredom, and began to sweep his gaze around the small courtyard. The courtyard's layout looked very quiet and beautiful. There was a pine tree on the left side of the courtyard. And, 4 or 5 long bamboos on its right side. They were nearly as tall as 2 or 3 people combined. Cai spread its wings and took off. He then landed on those tall bamboos. Shi Mu glanced toward Cai, and the corners of his mouth slightly moved. He then slowly pulled out his hand that was held by Zhongxiu. A trace of faint sadness flashed through Zhongxiu's eyes at first. Then, it disappeared from her eyes as if it never was there. Then, a smile glittered across her face. Brother Shi, I never thought that I would bump into you here. Nor did I. In fact, I am rather surprised to see you here, Lady Zhong. Have you also come here to attend this grand ceremony? Shi Mu thought of something, and asked. Zhongxiu's eyes slightly moved, and it seemed as if she was considering something. She then flashed a smile and replied after some time, that's right. Ascension to Immortality ceremony is a rare opportunity. I am still not formidable enough to participate. But, I wanted to pay a respect to my sex masters for holding a high opinion of me. So, I obviously have to try it once. We have been standing outside and speaking this entire time. It really slipped my mind to invite Brother Shi to my room to have a seat, Zhongxiu said in an apologetic manner. Then, she invited Shi Mu in her room. There were no basic amenities in that room apart from a few seats. Chapter 230, The Welcome Ceremony for Immortals. Translator, Novel Saga Editor, Novel Saga. Oh, I didn't expect that Brother Shi would also have. The two people took their respective seats. After that, Zhongxiu sensed that the aura around Shi Mu's body had changed. And, she couldn't help but reveal an expression of surprise as a result. I came across a few fortuitous encounters en route from the wasteland to the west. So, I turned out lucky in coagulating my qi. By the way, Lady Zhong, it seems like you have also broken the bottleneck quite smoothly, Shi Mu smiled. I would like to thank Brother Shi for presenting me the green frost fruit. Oh, by the way, why did Brother Shi come to the Heavenly U City? The Black Demon Sect is the branch of Heavenly Demon Sect as far as I know. I admit that Brother Shi is strong now. But, you shouldn't be able to attend the Ascension to Immortality ceremony, right? Zhongxiu nodded at first. But, something crossed her mind and she asked again. I have come here to find a certain someone, Shi Mu replied after a momentary hesitation. The glittering smile on Zhongxiu's face froze slightly. She was also a quick-witted and clear-sighted person after all. That's right. Brother Shi has reached the consummation stage of the agreement. So, you must be looking for Tianyin Sect's Ximen Shui, right? She asked. Shi Mu hesitated for a moment. Then, he gave her a nod. Senior sister Ximen Shui and I don't belong to the same sect. But, you may call it a propitious encounter that I got to see her once, roughly 7 or 8 days back. Zhongxiu took a deep breath. Then, she looked into Shi Mu's eyes and said. Really? Where is she now? Shi Mu was startled. He stood up and asked while involuntarily holding Zhongxiu's hands. Zhongxiu's cheeks turned red as soon as her hands were held by him. But, she didn't care about it the least. And, she simply looked at him without speaking anything. Ah, I'm sorry. I got a little excited. Shi Mu immediately regained his calm and loosened his grip from Zhongxiu's hands. It's all right, Zhongxiu lowered her head and replied in a murmuring tone. I have seen senior sister Ximen Shui just once that particular day. She's very different from me. She seems to have received great importance from the people of Transcending Heaven Immortal Cult. She might have been selected for seclusion training in the seclusion branch of the Transcending Heaven Immortal Cult that was set up in the Heavenly U City. It is said that they've set high standards for the selection of deserving candidates this time. She stopped for a moment. Then, she continued. Shi Mu's facial expression looked somewhat dejected as he heard these words. He had arrived in the Heavenly U City only a few days ago. But, he had more or less figured the situation that prevailed here. The Heavenly U City was the capital of the Lu Shan Kingdom. However, not every branch of the Transcending Heaven Immortal Cult was set up here. In fact, there was only one in this city. And, the Ascension to Immortality ceremony was conducted in this branch. The time of the grand ceremony was approaching. So, many great personalities of the immortal cult had begun to arrive in the city, including its leader. And, those disciples who were called by the seclusion branch for seclusion practice were greatly valued by the immortal cult. Ximen Shui possessed extraordinary innate talent. So, it seemed that Zhong Xiu's said words were perhaps right. Shi Mu shook his head. But, his facial expression looked even more firm. He wanted to see Ximen Shui once before the grand ceremony would start. And, things would become much easier since he was aware of Ximen Shui's location now. Lady Zhong, thank you for telling me about this matter, Shi Mu said. Is brother Shi is thinking of going to that seclusion branch to find her? Please forgive me for being blunt, but, I'm afraid that it won't be possible, Zhong Xiu spoke while shaking her head. Why is it so? Shi Mu asked. The welcome ceremony for the immortals is scheduled to be held after 3 days. So, the seclusion branch would be under tight security. Outsiders can't get close to it. I am afraid that you will have to wait until the completion of this welcome ceremony if you want to see senior sister Ximen Shui, Zhong Xiu explained. Welcome ceremony for the immortals. Shi Mu was dumbfounded. Brother Shi hasn't heard about it. 2 immortals of the Transcending Heaven immortal cult are supposed to arrive after 3 days. They've already ascended to the realm of the immortals. So, Transcending Heaven immortal cult is specially holding this welcome ceremony in order to welcome these 2 immortals, Zhong Xiu explained further. Immortals are arriving. Shi Mu was left startled as he heard these words. The rumors about the world of the immortals had always been vague and illusory. It was said that the previous outstanding disciples who had been elected by the successive ascension to immortality ceremony had already soared to the immortal realm. However, no one had witnessed them before. So, Shi Mu had never thought that he would get to see immortals descend to this world. Brother Shi's appearance makes it seem that he must be interested in this welcome ceremony, right? Wouldn't it be good if you tag along with me to visit this ceremony? It is said that the immortals are arriving for the first time after many years. Most of the dignitaries of the city receive an invitation to participate in this conference. But, they can only stay in the periphery to observe and emulate. Moreover, a person is also needed to pay a considerable quantity of spirit stones to enter. But, the disciples who are attending the Ascension to Immortality ceremony can enter the inner area to watch, Zhong Xiu said in an inviting manner. Great! I would like to put you in trouble in that case, Lady Zhong, Shi Mu considered for a moment. Then, he agreed. Zhong Xiu smiled in a sweet manner on hearing his reply. Her unparalleled mesmerizing appearance made Shi Mu's heart unable to bear but skip a beat. Oh, by the way, thank you so much for sending me the meteoric iron, Shi Mu coughed and hastily shifted the thread of discussion. I had randomly won that piece of strange metal in my sect. But, it was futile to keep it idle with me. Then, I vaguely remembered that the material of your black blade was apparently similar to this metal. I had noticed this thing that very day you came looking for me. Therefore, I sent someone to deliver you this thing. You liked it, right? Zhong Xiu's long eyelashes moved as she said. Shi Mu's heart overwhelmed with emotions as he heard these words. Zhong Xiu's eyes glistened magnificently. It seemed as if a layer of water had appeared in her eyes. Shi Mu's heart skipped a beat. And, he moved aside to avoid Zhong Xiu's gaze. Suddenly, a crash-bang sound mixed with a wing-flapping sound was heard. Cai had flown out to another room that was beside this living room. He stopped there on a wooden shelf that was not far from these 2 people. Shi Mu and Zhong Xiu didn't even notice when he had flown to the inside of the room. Cai, what are you doing there in Lady Zhong's room? Shi Mu's eyes turned, and he said in a reprimanding manner. He had vaguely seen furniture and other basic amenities when he passed through the door. And, he had reckoned that the said room must have been Zhong Xiu's bedroom. I came here to find something to eat. I have been starving to death ever since I've followed you. I haven't had a proper and delicious meal since ages. I finally got to see a few nuts in that restaurant with great difficulty. But, I again ended up eating only a few pieces of them before I was drawn by you. Cai shot a pitiful gaze at Shi Mu as he said. So, this is Brother Shi's spirit pet? You can even speak. You are very smart and adorable. Zhong Xiu looked at Cai, and the corners of her mouth curled into a smile as she spoke up. The elder sister looks like she has just walked out of a painting. You are very gorgeous. Cai's feet moved a few times toward Zhong Xiu as he replied in a flattering manner. Little parrot, you are called Cai? I have some fresh fruits here. I'll bring them for you to taste. Zhong Xiu's cheeks flushed. She got up and walked into the inside room with gentle footsteps. She then walked out holding a small package after some time. She took a few red nuts from the package, and placed them on the table. Cai's eyes brightened up. He fluttered its wings and flew over. He held a nut in his mouth. Then, he raised his neck, and swallowed it down. Delicious! Cai's eyes sparkled with excitement. He pecked in a fierce manner, and acclaimed aloud while keeping his head lowered. This stupid bird is very talkative and gluttonous. Shi Mu smiled as he spoke up in a somewhat helpless manner. It's not like that. Brother Shi thinks a lot. This little parrot is very lovable, Zhong Xiu replied with a smile. Shi Mu was about to say something again. However, the corners of his eyes suddenly caught a strange sight and his complexion changed. Cai had finished those red fruits after he had eaten a few mouthful of them. He had then turned around and rummaged through the package brought by Zhong Xiu. Then, a fiery red spirit stone had rolled out from it. Cai's eyes fell on that spirit stone. And, he grabbed it with his mouth. Then, he opened its mouth and swallowed it down. Cai, what are you eating? Shi Mu took notice of Cai's action. But, he had been too late to stop Cai since that spirit stone had already been eaten up by him. Zhong Xiu also noticed this scene. And, an astounded look appeared on her charming face. She had never heard of a spirit pet that could eat a spirit stone. Cai fluttered its wings, and a burst of red light emerged on the surface of his body. But, the red light dimmed after a short while. Afterwards, many strands of imperceptible red color appeared on his feathers. I'm stuffed. Cai released a satisfied burp and called out in a cheerful manner. After that, he flew to Shi Mu's shoulder and squatted down. Cai, you, Shi Mu concealed the flabbergasted look in his eyes as he asked. I've only eaten a spirit stone. There's nothing to fuss about, Cai announced in a casual manner. Shi Mu's brows creased into a frown as he thought of the underground cave in the Black Rock Mountains. Cai had swallowed several fire attributes fishes at that time. And, those fishes were the concentrated form of fire essence. So, it seemed like it wasn't a big issue for him after all. Shi Mu felt a little relieved in his heart at this realization. He glanced at Cai, and felt that this boisterous parrot had many secrets that he had concealed from Shi Mu. Lady Zhong, this parrot is very voracious. Please forgive me. Shi Mu drew out a low-ranked fire attribute spirit stone from his vast dust ring and placed it on the table. Brother Shi, you are very polite, Zhong Xiu waved her hand in a graceful manner. She then gazed into Cai's eyes, and her eyes filled with a look of curiosity. Lady Zhong, I'll take my leave now. I'll come to look for you after 3 days. Shi Mu stood up and bid farewell to her. A trace of unwillingness flashed through her eyes. It seemed as if she was reluctant to part with Shi Mu. But, she still came out to see him go. Oh, that's right. Brother Shi, where do you reside now? I can pass the necessary information to you if I get to know anything related to senior sister Ximen Shuet. Zhong Xiu thought of something and asked. Shi Mu's vision moved, and he shared the location of his inn with her. Pretty elder sister, you chill. I'll fix my attention on Shi Tou, and make him come over after 3 days, Cai shouted in assurance. Very talkative, Shi Mu gently tapped the parrot. Then, he greeted Zhong Xiu from afar and walked away. Zhong Xiu looked at the receding silhouette of Shi Mu as it gradually disappeared into the distance. Then, she closed the front door, and returned to her house. Her face revealed an exhilarated look. Suddenly, her eyes turned and fell on the table. She walked over and picked up the low-ranked fire attribute spirit stone that Shi Mu had handed over to her. She caressed it a few times. After that, she clasped her hands close to her chest, and closed her eyes. Master, your disciple may fail to live up to your expectations. However, I'll strive to attain a good position in this ceremony. Moreover, I'll try my best to earn a good reward for my sect, Zhong Xiu murmured after a long while. After 3 days, Shi Mu walked out of his inn at daybreak. Then, he began to walk in the direction of Zhong Xiu's post house. The stream of people on the street seemed significantly lesser at this time. The news of the welcome ceremony for the immortals seemed to have spread. In fact, it had spread in the entire Heavenly U city over these past few days. Therefore, almost everyone wanted to see the overbearing demeanor of the legendary immortals. So, people were walking towards the western part of the city in groups of 3 or 4. They were obviously heading to the seclusion branch of the Transcending Heaven Immortal Cult. Shi Tiu, you can grab a good seat if you walk a bit faster, Cai spoke up in an argumentative tone. Are you also interested in the immortals? Shi Mu continued to walk at a moderate pace. Shi Mu's heart was fully occupied with Ximen Shui's matter. So, he was only a little curious about this welcome ceremony.